Stannis Baratheon sat in the command tent, the dim flicker of candlelight dancing across his harsh features. Outside, the winds of the north howled, lashing the canvas walls with cold fury. It was not merely the wind that unsettled him. A deep conflict raged within, a question of life, of duty, of the line that men claim cannot be crossed. In the corner of the tent stood Melisandre, tall and graceful in her red robes, a silent flame in the darkness. She watched him with eyes that gleamed like embers, stirring in him both awe and dread. And near his camp bed, bundled in furs too large for her small frame, his daughter, Shireen, slept fitfully. Her brow was creased with nightmares that Stannis had no power to dispel. Love was a foreign word in his lexicon, overshadowed by the demands of kingship, but whenever he looked upon her, he felt a tenderness that was as fierce as the storms swirling around their camp. He had told Melisandre no. For the first time since following her counsel, Stannis had refused the path she laid out for him with unwavering conviction. The Red Woman's voice had whispered of sacrifices and prophecies, that only the death of royal blood could beckon the favor of R'hllor to melt away the bitter snows that clogged the hills. Yet something in Stannis's heart had rebelled at the notion of offering up the child he had fathered and raised. If he burned Shireen, he would be no better than the madman who had come before him. He had always considered himself rigid, a man forged in iron discipline. But fatherhood, a duty overshadowed by war and ambition, reasserted itself as powerfully as any vow. He forbade Melisandre from so much as touching Shireen. He threatened to send her away, to break from her counsel if ever she spoke such horrors again. The glare he fixed upon her had been like the cold truth of steel. Melisandre, for her part, had tilted her head, regarding him with some ineffable sorrow, but she had retreated. She had left the command tent without further protest, her red robes trailing across the snowy ground like a stain of blood upon white. Stannis had not slept well that night. Visions of Shireen's innocence haunted him. He had never been the warm father that stories celebrated. He had never known how to coax laughter from her or quell her tears with gentle words. But he had taught her letters and sums, taught her the histories of their house, taught her to hold her head high despite the grayscale scarring her cheek. Even if he had not excelled at fatherhood, at least he had not destroyed her. He would not do it now. He would not become the monster the realm thought him to be. Morning brought dreary light and a renewed onslaught of wind, but also a quiet hush in the camp. Word had spread. Somehow, rumor's wings had carried the notion that the king might sacrifice his own blood for victory. Men whispered, glancing sidelong at the tent where the princess slept. The common soldiers had never uttered it aloud, for fear of discipline, but the swirl of gossip was unstoppable. And when nothing came of it, when Shireen stepped out into the snow, walking uncertainly on stiff limbs, those rumors turned to quiet relief. The men saw that the princess yet lived, and their faith in Stannis soared anew. He was not the grizzled demon some claimed. He was their king, unwavering in justice, champion of law, father to a girl he refused to kill for advantage. For a time, that was enough to steel their hearts against the biting wind and the dwindling rations. Even men half-frozen and half-starved prefer to follow a leader who does not devour his own young. The days passed with slow torment, each hour seeming an eternity. The snows grew deeper, and the clouds never seemed to part. The Stormcrows, once paid Sellswords, wavered in their loyalty, but Ser Davos Seaworth stepped forth to remind them of what oath and gold required. With that, and a silent glance from the king, the Stormcrows gripped their spears and said no more of desertion. The knights from the Crownlands and Stormlands under Stannis's banner also found renewed purpose. For though their fortunes were bleak, they realized they followed a man who still stood by the ancient codes of chivalry, at least in the sense that he would not murder his daughter. A subtle difference, but in times as grim as these, small mercies were large indeed. And so the army pressed on through the wintry wilderness, aiming to lay siege to Winterfell, in the heart of Bolton territory. Stannis's plan was to draw the Boltons out, lure them into a pitched battle. A cunning strategy of misdirection was to create illusions of weakness or retreat to bait Ramsay and Roose Bolton into making a reckless assault. Melisandre continued to speak of fires in the night, omens and portents dancing in the flames, but she no longer uttered a word about burning Shireen. She had learned that Stannis' patience had a limit, and that he would not budge on this matter. Some of the men said they caught glimpses of tears in the Red Woman's eyes when she stared at Shireen, as if lamenting what she believed to be the cost of victory. But none dared speak of it to her face. At last the day came when the army, ragged from cold, arrived on the outskirts of Winterfell. The old castle loomed in the distance, dark stones stark against the snowy landscape. Great walls and towers reared up behind the thick drift. The Bolton banners hung from the battlements, the flayed man of House Bolton a cruel emblem. Inside, the usurper's forces were well-stocked and warm. If they refused to sally forth, Stannis' men might starve. But Stannis saw a sign that not all was stable in that fortress. The smell of fear, the subtle glimpses of movement in the parapets that suggested tension. The Boltons knew that if they remained cooped up, eventually the North would rally behind one who had any plausible claim to restore House Stark or at least overthrow them. The Boltons understood that a protracted siege might also weaken their hold, and so a standoff began. The next night, an unexpected squall descended, burying tents and men alike under thick blankets of snow. Fires struggled to stay lit, and the freezing wind stole the warmth from living bodies. Horses died in their stalls or from the constant exposure. Yet morale held. Unexpectedly, the men found new purpose in their cause. Stannis did not let Shireen freeze. He had her guarded by a dedicated group of men who always kept a brazier near her tent and made certain she ate a share of the dwindling rations. He was their king, and this was his daughter. Even those from other lands, those who once sneered at the mention of Stannis' name, discovered in themselves an odd pride. Through it all, Stannis remained unyielding, standing in the snow himself, cold as the ice, his face set like stone. He had always been the unbroken spire in raging seas. Now the men saw him as a father who might be cruel, might be unrelenting, but would never break faith as he had been tempted to do. One evening, as darkness gathered, Melisandre came to him with a new vision. Her voice trembled with awe. "I have seen victory in the flames," she whispered, her breath forming a faint mist in the frigid air. "Not with the sacrifice of your daughter's life, but through the intangible power that your decision stirs in the hearts of your men. You shall meet the bastard of Bolton on the field of battle, and the Lord of Winterfell shall not stand against you. Light will guide us through the darkest hour." Stannis glanced up from his map. Part of him wanted to sneer, to bark that her new prophecy was suspiciously convenient. Yet a whisper of relief wound through him. He had not wanted to sever his relationship with the Red Woman completely. He still needed her counsel, the illusions or sorceries she commanded, the fires that gave them small advantages. Now that she was offering a path forward without demanding Shireen's life, he felt a tension ease in the back of his neck. But he spoke no words of gratitude, merely gave a stiff nod. He would accept any sign that did not demand he betray his child. Scouts brought word that within Winterfell, Roose and Ramsay debated how to respond to the siege. The winter storms could do Stannis' work for them. If the king's army froze and starved, the Boltons would gain an easy victory. Yet Roose was wary. The North was not entirely subdued. Men loyal to the memory of House Stark had begun to shift quietly. Some whispered that Stannis Baratheon had come to rescue them from the dread flares of the Dread Fort. Others still mistrusted him, calling him an outsider with only a passing claim. But if rumors of Stannis refusing to sacrifice his own daughter spread, it might earn him a sliver of the North's heart. Stannis believed it was only a matter of time before minor houses, the Mormonts and others, decided they would rather see him on the throne of the North than the butchers who wore the flayed man. This, Stannis believed, would prompt the Boltons to act quickly. They could not allow discontent to grow. They would come out, or so he hoped. 3 days later, the Watchers on the perimeter came bearing news. Ramsay Bolton led a force out of Winterfell's gates under the cover of night, and they had begun skirmishes around the perimeter. Archers from Stannis' lines reported movements, the quick flash of torches passing behind ridges of snow as if the Bolton troops sought to probe for weak points. But Stannis had placed his men strategically, and Davos had done well to keep morale up. Even though the weather remained brutal, not a single large-scale desertion had occurred. The Sellswords who might have fled found themselves facing not a camp desperate and sinking, but an army grimly resolute, its fighting spirit galvanized by something intangible. The princess's survival had become a symbol. If Stannis could spare her, then maybe the men themselves were not expendable cogs in a tyrant's machine. Slowly, rumor turned that notion into a half-religion of its own. Here was a leader who'd chosen compassion, even if it warred with his nature over cold calculation. Under swirling gray skies, the Bolton forces began to muster. Scouts counted their banners from afar, the flayed man in larger numbers than Stannis's battered host. Yet they were not a unified force, for inside the castle walls were various houses that bent the knee to the Boltons from fear rather than devotion. Men whispered that certain bannermen would not shed tears if Ramsay fell in battle. Word also came that a rescue party from the Vale had not marched. They lingered, uncertain of the tides of war. Still, Stannis had an advantage in discipline, a smaller but more tightly knit force. He had begun ordering palisades erected, trenches dug, despite the frozen ground. Every day, the men toiled with picks and shovels, cursing the cold. Yet they did it because Stannis himself stood among them, not shirking his share of hardship. Frozen sweat clung to his brow, but he drove them onward. Night fell. Fires crackled in the camp. Melisandre stood before one, chanting in a language few understood. Ser Davos approached Stannis quietly, a worried look in his eyes. "They will come, your grace. But how will we meet them in the field if we are half-starved?" Stannis's expression did not waver. "We will meet them with steel and courage, Ser Davos. The same way we have met every challenge." He paused, gazing at the dancing flames. "And we will trust in the justice of our cause." Davos inclined his head, though a flicker of doubt lingered. "If the Boltons sally out in force, we'll be outnumbered. Unless the Karstarks change sides. We still hold out hope for the Mormonts. The Umbers. They will come," Stannis said. Yet he refrained from explaining how he knew. He recalled a conversation with a raven-haired girl in a heavy cloak of black and gray. Lyanna Mormont had insisted the Mormonts recognized only a king in the north whose name was Stark. Stannis had tried to persuade her that he fought for the same cause, liberation from the Boltons. She had been unmoved at the time, but rumor had it that the Raven Stannis had sent continued to petition for help. Perhaps the Bear Island men would not rally to his banner by name, but maybe they would come to help topple the Boltons. That was his hope. He parted from Davos and went to Shireen's tent. She was awake, her sad, solemn eyes brightening when she saw him. He stiffly returned her smile. He was not a man of affectionate gestures, but he laid a hand on her shoulder. "Are you warm?" he asked. She nodded. "It's cold, but the men bring me fresh furs." A faint flush spread across her cheeks. "Father, may I?" Stannis raised a hand to halt her words. "In a few days, we may be forced into battle. Stay within the lines. I'll assign guards. You must keep safe." A pause hung between them. "There is nothing I would not do to see you come out of this unharmed." For a man who seldom voiced personal feelings, this was as close to an avowal of love as any. Shireen's eyes glistened, but she only nodded. Stannis stepped back into the biting air, quietly determined that no harm would come to his daughter, no matter the cost. That night, before dawn could banish the gloom, Ramsay Bolton attacked. He chose to strike the outskirts of Stannis's camp, sending a band of men to torch supply wagons, hoping to starve the king's army further. A swift alarm rose, and Stannis rode out with the vanguard, half-armored, cloaks snapping behind him in the wind. Torches flared, and men shouted. Swords flashed under the moonlight. Steel rang against steel. The Stormcrows fought fiercely, seeking to hold the line. Davos rallied the men behind a makeshift barricade. Ramsay's raiders came howling out of the dark, eager to slay and burn. Yet they discovered that the men who had braved weeks of bitter cold had grown accustomed to adversity. The Watchers spotted them, the archers loosed arrows. Several of Ramsay's men toppled into the snow. Then the defenders surged forward, pressing the raiders back. At the apex of the fight, Stannis himself clashed swords with a man brandishing the flayed man's sigil. The soldier's blow was deflected. Stannis returned it, hacking down with the fury of a man who has everything to lose. Blood spattered, hot against the freezing air. Within minutes, the Bolton raiders realized they would not break these lines so easily. They retreated into the darkness, leaving behind the broken bodies of their dead. The king stood, breath steaming, sword red with blood, as Watchers called out that the raiders were withdrawing. Davos came to his side, panting. "They've only tested us, your grace. They mean to gauge our strength." "Then we have shown them," Stannis growled. He glanced at the torched remnants of 2 wagons, and a scowl deepened the lines on his face. They had lost more provisions. The men would eat even less tomorrow. A worry ate at him. This war of attrition might be what the Boltons wanted. But he steeled his jaw. He would find a way. As dawn broke, the scene around the camp was as grim as ever. Bodies had stiffened in the cold, icicles forming from spilled blood. The men went about the sorrowful task of burying their dead in shallow trenches or else burning them in pyres if the ground was too frozen. A hush fell, the hush of an army that realized it was standing at the threshold of a crucial fight. No one openly questioned why they did not simply pack up and leave. They knew the reason. Stannis was determined. This was his shot at claiming the North, at retribution against the Boltons who had betrayed the crown and butchered Robb Stark at the Red Wedding. Even if justice were a flimsy concept in a land governed by power, Stannis believed in it with the fervor of a zealot. If he left, he would be abandoning that cause. He could not do so. Nor would his men want to be remembered as the rabble that turned tail against the flayed man. A day later, the horns sounded in the pale morning. The Boltons were coming out in force. A mounted host emerged from Winterfell's gates, banners rippling in the chill wind, drifts of snow swirling about their horses' hooves. Leading them was a man with pale, hungry eyes, the corners of his mouth lifted in a sadistic grin. Ramsay Bolton, they said, was more beast than man, loving the screams of the tortured. He had that cruelty in his stare as he surveyed Stannis' lines from afar. On the battlements behind him, the watchers observed, the stoic figure of Roose Bolton stood, his face unreadable. The father let the bastard son do the dirty work. Stannis called his men to arms. The clang of metal, the shuffle of boots in the snow, the snorting of frightened horses, the sounds of an army preparing for battle. His standard-bearer lifted the flaming heart of the Lord of Light, though the men still wore the crowned stag sigil of House Baratheon. Melisandre stood by, her breath forming white ghosts in the cold air, her eyes fixed upon the horizon. She had lit a small brazier, chanting a low prayer. Stannis did not know if Lawler truly listened, but he allowed it. Perhaps a measure of the Red God's favor would tip the balance. Behind him, the formation of knights, footmen, and sellswords stretched out in disciplined lines. The discipline was all the more impressive given the hardships endured. Yet the men stood in defiance. Even the battered knights from Dragonstone, men who once had questioned Stannis' claim to anything beyond his small domain, now faced forward with grim purpose. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to bow out now. Davos Seaworth moved among them, barking words of encouragement, telling them to remember the false kings of the realm, the betrayals at King's Landing, the monstrous death of King Robert's line, if indeed Joffrey had been Robert's line. They had a rightful cause, Davos shouted. Let that cause guide their swords. Ramsay advanced. His cavalry fanned out to encircle the outskirts of Stannis' defenses, hoping to find a soft spot. Archers from Stannis' side loosed arrows. Some found marks, striking riders who tumbled from saddles, screaming. The snow quickly drank in their blood. Ramsay commanded his men forward and they charged, hooves pounding like thunder. They slammed into Stannis' outer lines, encountering sharpened stakes that had been placed as a makeshift defense. Horses screamed, men cursed. Some of the cavalry crashed violently, but others found gaps. The fighting erupted into chaos, steel clashing, war cries echoing in the frozen air. Stannis rode at the head of his own horsemen, forcing his mount to gallop over uneven snow, leading a countercharge. He met the Bolton riders in a tumult of swords and axes. Blood sprayed across the white ground as men toppled. A Bolton knight swung at Stannis, missing by a hair, only to be struck down by the king's answering blow. Stannis' skill with the blade was overshadowed only by his ferocious will. He spurred his horse deeper into the fray, refusing to yield an inch. All around him, the storm of battle raged. War horns bellowed, men slid in the churned, bloody snow. Shouts of Stannis for the king mingled with the wails of the dying. Ramsay withdrew slightly with his cavalry, then swung to attack from another angle. He was testing for weaknesses, trying to unravel Stannis' formation. But the king had learned from the mistakes made on the Blackwater. He had not advanced blindly. He had formed ranks of infantry behind the sharpened stakes, archers on the flanks, and a small cavalry reserve under the command of a knight from the Stormlands. They unleashed volley after volley of arrows, cutting down the next wave of Bolton riders. Ramsay roared, spurring his men to press on. He likely knew that if he retreated after a brazen show, Roose Bolton's fury would be his to face. So he pressed forward, letting hate and cruelty fuel him. He would tear through Stannis' lines or die trying. Smoke and snow swirled in the air, a dizzying mixture of white and gray as fires flickered from scattered braziers broken by the chaos of charging horses. A cold, punishing wind scoured the field. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Still, the men fought on. In the midst of this wreck, Ramsay's personal guard crashed into Stannis' flank, nearly breaking the lines. For a moment, the tide hung in the balance. Then from the rear came the Stormcrows, mercenaries who had once wavered in their loyalty but had found new purpose. They slammed into Ramsay's guard with savage intensity, scattering them. Ramsay himself was forced to retreat, cursing. As the hours trudged by, the land near Winterfell turned into a graveyard of men and horses. Bodies lay haphazardly, some missing limbs, some with faces frozen in grotesque death masks. The snow steadily turned red. Yet the Bolton forces found themselves unable to completely break Stannis. The king's lines refused to crumble. His men, half-starved and nearly frozen, fought with the desperation of those who know there is no tomorrow if they fail. And somewhere behind that line, Shireen was safely guarded. Perhaps that knowledge gave them strength. They fought not just for a cold and distant king, but for a cause that had awakened something in them. Late afternoon light, feeble and gray, slanted across the battlefield when Ramsay called for a retreat. Horn blasts signaled his men to pull back. Some seemed relieved. The stiffening cold had begun to sap their strength, and the resolve of Stannis' army had proven more formidable than they'd expected. They galloped and stumbled away, leaving the torn field behind. Stannis, battered and bloody, looked after them with grim satisfaction. He refused to pursue immediately. He knew better than to fling his men headlong into a trap. Instead, he rallied his forces, reorganizing them to ensure no second wave caught them unawares. He sent out scouts to confirm that Ramsay was truly retreating back inside Winterfell's gates. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the watchers confirmed the Bolton flags withdrew behind the walls. The outer yard was deserted. In the camp that night, the men nursed wounds and counted the dead. A somber hush fell. The price had been steep, but they had not been broken. Stannis went among the wounded, which was not his usual practice. A king's place was often said to be apart from the suffering of common men, but Stannis found his feet carrying him through the tents where soldiers lay moaning in pain. Perhaps it was some stirring of conscience that propelled him. He clasped arms, offered a terse nod of respect. Even a stern king's acknowledgement brightened the men's eyes. Many had lost friends and brothers. But in the gloom, they saw their king wordlessly thanking them for their sacrifice. In that bleak hour, it was enough to sustain them. Melisandre's presence grew nearly spectral. She moved among the braziers, sprinkling powders that made the flames burn bright. She would lean over men who lingered near death, whispering prayers. Some recovered, though whether by the Red God's grace or simple fortune, none could say. Ser Davos, for his part, helped carry bandages, commiserated with the men. Then he joined Stannis near a battered war table. "We lost many," Davos said quietly. Stannis nodded. "Yes, but the Boltons bled as well." Davos sighed. "Will they attack again?" "They have no choice. Either they come to us or we find a way inside those walls. This standstill cannot last, or else we all starve." Davos stared at the flickering candle. "A siege in this weather is madness." "I agree," Stannis said. "But a siege is all we have at present. Unless the north rises." That same night, a horn blast echoed from the perimeter. Messengers rushed in, speaking of a small party approaching under a flag of truce. Curious, Stannis stepped out into the moonlit snow. Torches revealed a group of riders, leading a single figure who held a tattered white banner. They drew close, slow, wary. The leader dismounted, flanked by two others. The watchers parted as Stannis stepped forward, hand on his sword. They revealed themselves to be men loyal to House Mormont. At their heads stood a burly, bearded warrior, not the famed Lord Commander's relative but one of the lesser Mormonts, holding letters. He bowed stiffly to Stannis. "We bring word from Bear Island. We hear you stand against the Boltons who murder and flay. We do not name you king in the north, for that name belongs only to a Stark. But we see your cause, and we have come to do our part." Stannis' expression remained stern, yet inside, relief coursed through him. Men from Bear Island were rumored to be as fierce as any in the realm, though fewer in number. He accepted them. "You have my thanks," he said curtly. The Mormonts nodded, unsmiling but resolved. Their presence, though small, signaled a crucial shift. In the following days, more trickled in. A handful of Umbers outraged by the Boltons' rule. Men from other minor houses. Not large armies, but enough to disrupt the Bolton stronghold. Slowly, the tide shifted from utter stalemate to something more fluid. The new arrivals told stories of how the Boltons terrorized their vassals, how they demanded loyalty through fear. They also spoke of the rumors that Stannis Baratheon had spared his daughter from a vile sacrifice. Some dismissed it as campfire chatter, but others clung to it as proof that this king might be stern, but not a monster. And for the North, a single measure of decency could outweigh many southern claims. Encouraged by these developments, Stannis began to plan a final assault. Winterfell's walls would be tough to breach, but if the defenders were divided in loyalty, or if the Bolton forces were drawn out once more, the door might open. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton grew uneasy. Ramsay's defeat in the field had sapped the men's confidence in his leadership. Rumors of Stannis receiving northern support rattled them. Some said that Roose considered parley or negotiation, but Ramsay would have none of it. Conflict brewed within those walls. Another week passed. Snow buried the dead from the first major clash. Occasional skirmishes erupted near the gates, but neither side risked open war again. Supplies ran low in Stannis' camp. The men grew gaunt, hollow-eyed. Hunger gnawed at them as relentless as the wind. Yet a grim determination hung in the air. Stannis refused to speak of retreat. Davos voiced concern for the men, but the king shook his head. If we leave now, the Boltons will only grow stronger. We hold the advantage of their battered pride. Soon, we strike or starve. When the final day dawned, it came quietly with no glorious sunrise. Only a gray light spreading across a desolate plain. The watchers announced movement at the gates. A large force of Bolton men with Ramsay at the forefront was assembling. Whether from desperation or arrogance, they were marching out again. Perhaps Roose had realized morale was eroding with every day they cowered. If they had enough numbers left to crush Stannis in one decisive battle, so be it. Stannis mustered his men once more. The survivors of the first battle rejoined the lines, stoic if battered. The Mormonts and other northern volunteers took positions on the flanks. Melisandre stood near Stannis, her hood pulled up against the biting wind, chanting softly. The men felt the tension crackle like static. Weapons were checked, shields hefted. Banners fluttered. Then came the forward march. Stannis led them, the king in battered armor, jaw set. This time, there would be no partial engagement. It would be all or nothing. The two forces met on the open field, the frozen ground as unyielding beneath their boots as the men's spirits. Horns blared. Ramsay howled for his men to crush these southerners and traitors. Stannis raised his sword and the entire host surged forward. The second battle of Winterfell began in earnest. Bolton archers let fly. Arrows hissed through the air, some finding targets among Stannis' front ranks. Men fell with screams. But Stannis' archers retaliated, a dark hail falling upon the Bolton lines. The cavalry from both sides collided with bone-shattering force. Horses screamed, men were thrown, swords hacked. The foot soldiers advanced, pressing in on one another in a brutal melee. Spears drove through armor, axes bit into flesh. Shields splintered. The clamor of steel and the roars of men and beasts alike drowned out all rational thought. Snow churned beneath them, red slush rising to the surface. Stannis fought at the heart of it, cutting down foes with single-minded focus. He felt no mercy, only the savage determination that had defined him his entire life. A Bolton man snarled and swung a mace. Stannis parried, punching his shield forward to knock the man off balance. Another slash of the sword opened the man's neck. Blood sprayed. Nearby, Davos fought with a borrowed sword, rallying a group of foot soldiers. He shouted for them to hold formation. The Mormonts, bellowing war cries, surged in from the flank, tearing into the Bolton line. Ramsay's eyes gleamed with a hideous delight as he led his own guard, seeking out men who looked vulnerable. He took pleasure in cutting them down or letting them limp away so he could watch them bleed. But amidst the chaos, he did not realize that his lines were fracturing faster than Stannis's. Several smaller northern houses, forced by fear to fight under the Bolton banner, began to break ranks and retreat when they saw the tide turning. Some even turned on the Boltons, quietly refusing to reinforce them. Slowly, the flayed man banner sagged under the weight of betrayal and disorganization. At one critical juncture, Ramsay found himself isolated, his guard scattered. He fought like a cornered beast, slaughtering 2 stormcrows who tried to take him. A savage joy lit his face as he saw an opening and began to carve a path back toward Winterfell, calling for his father's men to rally. But the men did not rally. They were in disarray. Some refused to follow him, and others were pinned down by the unrelenting push of Stannis' forces. Ramsay snarled, turning his horse to race along the line, seeking an exit. But the Mormonts closed in. The ring tightened. Stannis glimpsed the chaos from a vantage point on a small rise. The Bolton line was collapsing. He urged his mount forward. The final push cut through the remnants of the enemy formation. Shouts of surrender began to arise, though in the heat of battle, few were spared. Ramsay, seeing no path for a glorious stand, broke away, spurring his horse toward Winterfell's gates. But as the battered riders turned, the watchers on the castle walls did not open the gates. Roose Bolton had apparently decided that letting the battered remains of Ramsay's contingent re-enter would only worsen the siege from within. Or perhaps he believed them doomed. So Ramsay found himself locked out. The gates remained barred. He shrieked in fury, turning his horse around to see the approaching tide of Stannis' men. Like a mad dog cornered, he spurred his horse to a final stand. It did not last long. An arrow from a Mormont bow lodged in his shoulder. Another sank into his thigh. Ramsay toppled from the saddle, groaning and cursing. A Sellsword seized him, but the bastard lord still had a knife. He slashed the man across the face. Another soldier struck him with the pommel of a sword, sending him to his knees. The men pinned him down, disarming him. They looked to Stannis for guidance. The king approached, breath ragged, sword dripping with blood. His horse stomped, nearly losing its footing on the slick snow. He stared down at the battered figure of Ramsay Bolton. Ramsay's lip curled in a snarl, but there was fear in his eyes. He spat blood into the snow. "You are no king," he hissed. Stannis dismounted, ignoring the trembling in his limbs from exhaustion. He leveled a cold gaze at Ramsay. "I am your judge," he said simply. Then he gestured, and one of his men lifted Ramsay by the collar. Davos arrived, face grim. The men awaited the king's decree. Stannis felt the swirl of conflicting impulses. On one hand, this was a vile beast who deserved no mercy. On the other, an example needed to be made. Ultimately, Stannis had never been known for softness. He gave the short command for Ramsay Bolton to be executed for treason, murder, and crimes against the realm. The men did not hesitate. A swift stroke of steel severed the bastard of Bolton's head. The deed was done, ending one of the most sadistic chapters the North had ever witnessed. A hush fell over the battlefield, broken only by the moans of wounded men. The Bolton forces, seeing their leader slain, dropped their weapons and surrendered or fled into the wild. They knew their cause was lost, especially with the gates barred behind them. The battered remains of Stannis' army let up a ragged cheer. They had won a victory they scarcely believed possible. And still Winterfell's gate remained closed. Roose Bolton likely stood on the ramparts, observing. Without Ramsay to lead reckless charges, and seeing his men decimated, Roose might have surrendered quietly. But the man was cunning and cautious, known for his cold cruelty. Stannis ordered a partial encirclement of the castle. But in truth, he had not the strength left for a long siege. Some of the newly arrived northern volunteers stepped forward, proclaiming they would see the Boltons driven out for good. They would help breach the gates if needed or starve Roose out. Word spread that many inside Winterfell might be sympathetic to Stannis or at least hostile to the Boltons. Perhaps roving bands within the fortress would open a postern gate to let loyal men inside. So Stannis waited for darkness. Sure enough, that very night, a minor gate was unbarred from within. A group of men from House Dustin, who had grown to despise Roose's tyranny, invited a contingent of Stannis' men into the castle. A silent infiltration began. The men, half frozen and exhausted from the day's battle, crept through the courtyard. They met sporadic resistance from Bolton diehards, but the fighting was brief and vicious. By dawn, the men reached the Great Hall. The final standoff with Roose Bolton occurred in the presence of half a dozen of his loyal guards. They barricaded themselves in the hall, but the infiltration force was quickly joined by more men pushing in through the yard. Caught in a hopeless position, Roose stood, silent as always, scanning the faces around him. He had no illusions about mercy. His banner had been one of flayed skin. Stannis arrived, dark circles under his eyes, face spattered with dried blood. He and Roose exchanged a long, silent look. The tension was thick enough to choke a man. Roose at last inclined his head, as though acknowledging a final checkmate. He laid down his sword with the calm of a man who sees the future. The few Bolton guards looked ready to fight to the death, but a swift command from Roose halted them. They relinquished their weapons, though their eyes glinted with sullen fury. Some wanted to die, but the Lord Father had chosen a different end. Stannis's men took Roose prisoner. A hush fell in Winterfell's corridors and halls. The seat of the North had been wrested from House Bolton's control. The flayed man banners were torn down, replaced by Stannis's own or by blank spaces. Many in the fortress, the small folk and lesser household members, peeked out of doors, uncertain whether to rejoice or fear. Yet when no immediate slaughter or looting began, beyond the minimal vengeance inflicted on a few of Ramsay's men, relief seeped through the corridors. House Bolton had reigned by fear. Now perhaps that fear would recede. Some men from the north, seeing the new occupant of Winterfell, voiced confusion. They had yearned for a Stark, but there was no Stark to be found. Others simply felt relief that the Boltons were dethroned, that the flaying and cruelty had come to an end. Stannis set up his seat in the Great Hall, if only temporarily. He had no illusions that the North would unanimously name him their lord. But for now, he could restore order. He allowed Melisandre to stand behind him, though he could not dismiss a faint tremor of apprehension. He had once pinned all his hopes on the Red Woman's prophecy, and she had nearly driven him to the unspeakable act of sacrificing Shireen. Yet she had stood with him, too, when he defied that darkest choice. The lines between friend and foe had blurred. A makeshift council convened, with Ser Davos at Stannis' side. Representatives from the northern houses arrived, some timid, some defiant, to see what terms the new occupant of Winterfell would offer. In that moment, Stannis addressed them with rare candor. He laid out that the Boltons were dethroned. Roose Bolton would face judgment for his role in the Red Wedding and for the atrocities inflicted upon the North. Stannis' claim to the Iron Throne was a broader matter, but here in the North, he promised to restore justice and do away with cruelty. He spoke of re-establishing the laws that had guided the realm in better days, ensuring that the small folk no longer lived in terror of flaying knives. Some of the lords bristled. They wanted the name Stark returned. But there was no surviving Stark in sight, at least none present at Winterfell. Rumors of Sansa Stark's whereabouts were whispered or that Rickon might yet live, but nothing was certain. Stannis assured them that if a true Stark heir came forward, he would do right by the ancient traditions. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Their hearts were with the Stark name, but they also recognized that Stannis had liberated them from a monstrous foe. And so, grudgingly, they listened. In time, they might come to accept him or at least coexist for the sake of stability. That night, Shireen was brought within Winterfell's walls and given a warm chamber. Stannis himself took a moment to sit with her in the room, the flicker of a small fireplace casting wavering light across the stone walls. Shireen looked up at him with wide eyes. "Father, is it over?" she asked softly. Stannis gazed into the fire, at once comforted and disturbed by its resemblance to Melisandre's flames. "Much remains undone," he said at length. "But for now we have taken Winterfell. We have put an end to the Bolton menace." He glanced at his daughter. "Are you well?" The journey was difficult. Shireen nodded, her cheek bearing the grayscale scars that had always set her apart. "The men kept me safe, and Lady Melisandre, she prays for us, I think." Stannis was silent, remembering how close he had come to listening to Melisandre's urging that Shireen be offered as sacrifice. He felt a stab of guilt so deep it nearly stole his breath. But Shireen was here, alive, and he had chosen fatherhood over fanaticism. That knowledge gave him the faintest glimmer of peace. "You should rest," he told her. "We will remain here for some time." Outside, the battered soldiers of Stannis' host celebrated in quiet ways. They finally had roofs over their heads, fires to warm their half-frozen fingers and toes. The dread that had hung over them began to lift. Even the Sellswords found themselves grateful for survival, for the knowledge that their side had won a seemingly impossible victory. Morale soared. Men who had once been uneasy or distrustful of Stannis now toasted him as the savior of the North, or at least the avenger of its suffering. House Mormont men seemed aloof yet faintly respectful, acknowledging that Stannis had done what they believed only a king of the North could do. In the days that followed, Stannis held trial for Roose Bolton. The man was found guilty of treason, murder, and unspeakable crimes. The lords who had lost loved ones at the Red Wedding demanded his blood. Roose, stoic as always, accepted his fate, though a flicker of fear shone in his pale eyes. Stannis ordered a public execution. Many came to watch, not out of love for Stannis, but out of thirst for vengeance. The memory of Ned Stark's sense of justice lingered in this courtyard. It was said Ned Stark would swing the sword himself. Stannis, grim and silent, took the duty upon himself. He stepped forward, accepted the heavy greatsword. Roose offered no final words. The sword struck true, ending House Bolton's reign of cruelty in the north. With the Boltons gone, Stannis began the delicate process of re-establishing order. Winterfell's ravaged stores had to be inventoried. Surviving small folk needed leadership. The battered fortress required repairs. Some northern houses declared themselves free of southern rule. Others, pragmatic, decided that banding together under Stannis was their best chance for surviving the winter, especially with rumors of terrifying armies of the dead beyond the wall. Stannis, never a man to mince words, told them that if they refused to join him, they would have no protection against the horrors rumored to march in the far north. He demanded fealty, or at least an alliance of mutual defense. The majority, seeing no better option, agreed. And so the king in the narrow sea, as some mockingly called him, found himself enthroned, albeit temporarily, in the seat of the kings in the north. The irony was not lost on him. He had never aspired to rule these frozen lands, only to enforce his rightful claim and restore justice to the Seven Kingdoms. Yet here he was, forging an alliance with the North's lesser houses, each step bristling with potential pitfalls. The Red Woman continued to prophesy, but now her words were about forging a united front against the darkness, about how Stannis' choice to spare Shireen had awakened new possibilities. Stannis listened, but he also listened to Davos and to the quiet pleas of Shireen. He would not let prophecy overshadow his sense of duty or paternal love again. In the weeks that followed, a cautious peace settled over Winterfell. Stannis' men patrolled the surrounding countryside, mopping up stray Bolton loyalists or bandits. The Mormonts and Umbers who had joined him took on responsibilities for distributing what food could be gathered. It was a meager existence, but at least the threat of immediate slaughter had passed. Slowly, the local folk crept back to their homes, hoping that perhaps life would regain some semblance of normalcy. The banners with the crowned stag or the red heart of Lawler fluttered from the battlements, an uneasy mixture of faiths and claims. Yet none challenged the new order publicly. The holdouts who had once supported the Boltons found themselves marginalized. Some of their leading lords were executed or exiled and their lands forfeited to those who had joined Stannis. It was rough justice reminiscent of how Robert Baratheon had rewarded loyal men after the rebellion. But in the savage times that had followed the Red Wedding, men expected no less. As the northern winds howled, carrying the promise of an even harsher winter, it seemed to many that the stability Stannis offered was better than the chaos of the Boltons. One morning, Ser Davos entered the Great Hall to find Stannis conferring with a group of northern chieftains. They were discussing the wildlings. Jon Snow, the new Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, had apparently let wildlings pass through the wall to escape the White Walkers. That news disturbed many of the northern lords who saw wildlings as murderers and thieves. Stannis, however, listened carefully. He recognized an opportunity to bolster his own forces. The wildlings, if properly managed, might lend valuable manpower against the threats that loomed, both from the White Walkers and from any southern challengers that might seek to dethrone Stannis. He decided to send messages to the Wall, seeking an audience with Jon Snow to negotiate an accord. Some of the northern chieftains balked, but Stannis overruled them. Survival in winter demanded alliances that once seemed impossible. Melisandre stood by the towering hearth, regarding the men with serene intensity. She seemed oddly content, as though seeing some part of her prophecy come true. When Davos caught her eye, he could not read her intentions. But he remembered the night she had first proposed burning Shireen and how that had nearly destroyed them all. He would never forgive her for that suggestion, but he was wise enough to keep the peace. She had convinced Stannis of many things that led to victory. Perhaps she believed everything she did was for a higher cause. Still, Davos quietly resolved to keep a close watch. He would never let the princess out of his sight when Melisandre was near. The memory of that almost sacrifice weighed too heavily on his heart. Word spread through the north that Stannis Baratheon had taken Winterfell. Men from scattered villages, from hidden crofts in the mountains, from fishing hamlets along the stony shore, came to see what sort of man now claimed the seat of the ancient kings. They found a severe ruler, one who doled out punishments with a heavy hand if they broke the law, but who did not flay them, who did not burn children at the stake. It was a harsh reign, yes, but fair in its own way. The old laws of the North began to mesh with the laws Stannis brought from the South, creating an uneasy synergy. Trials were held for criminals, and the most egregious were executed swiftly. Houses that had lost everything to the Boltons found a measure of restitution in the redistribution of farmland and holdfasts. None could claim it was an ideal solution, but after the horrors they had endured, it was better than the alternative. In time, more travelers arrived, bringing whispered news that the Lannisters were weakened by internal strife, that the Iron Throne in King's Landing might not be as secure as it once was. Some urged Stannis to march south to seize his birthright, but the king refused. He would not leave the North vulnerable to the White Walkers or the stray Bolton loyalists. He intended to fortify his new hold, secure the realm from the northern threat, and then consider how best to claim the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. He had not forgotten the throne he believed was his by right. But the nightmares Melisandre had conjured of an icy darkness swallowing the living weighed on him as well. For once, he found himself more concerned with a threat beyond politics. The North proved a crucible. Each passing week tested Stannis' leadership. Minor rebellions flared. A group of Karstarks tried to free Roose Bolton's imprisoned men. They were subdued, and Stannis gave them a stark choice: bend the knee or face exile. They bowed resentfully, but it prevented further bloodshed. Another group near White Harbor threatened to close its gates to Stannis' envoys. He sent a sternly worded missive reminding them that refusing the king's authority in wartime could be considered treason. The Manderleys, reluctant though they were, found themselves compelled to maintain a tenuous alliance. House Manderley was rumored to support a hidden Stark cause, but they were not ready to fight open war. So a fragile peace extended, each side waiting, uncertain if the snows would bury them all before a true reconciliation could be formed. Through it all, Shireen thrived in her own quiet way. Freed from the constant terror of the road, she explored Winterfell's courtyards, occasionally sneaking into the library or the crypts with childlike curiosity. The castle's staff, warmed by her timid smiles, grew to adore her. She was a Baratheon in the seat of the Starks, but her gentle manner and scars endeared her to some of the northern folk. She even befriended a few local children who'd taken shelter in the castle. These children, whose parents had been scattered or killed, found comfort in her shy kindness. Shireen's presence worked more wonders than Stannis realized. It softened the hearts of people who might otherwise have seen him as just another harsh invader. If a man who commanded a child's respect, a man who protected his daughter so fiercely, ruled Winterfell, perhaps he was not a monster. One chilly afternoon, Stannis came upon Shireen in the courtyard, feeding the ravens alongside a stable boy. She looked up at her father, a startled expression on her face, but he only nodded and asked how the ravens were faring. She stammered that one was injured, but she was tending to it. Her father simply regarded her in silence. He did not praise her, for that was not his way, but a faint softness in his eyes spoke volumes. Inwardly, he felt a surge of relief that she was here, alive, forging small bonds. He remembered, with stark clarity, how close he had come to losing her. He could not undo the guilt, but he could live in a way that honored what remained. The winter deepened. Snow piled high, and the nights grew longer. But in Winterfell there was warmth once more. Hearths blazed. Men told stories in the Great Hall. The city beyond the walls revived, as trade caravans began to trickle in again, guarded by men loyal to Stannis. Hunting parties ventured out for game, though many were lost in the drifts. The spiked heads of Ramsay and Roose Bolton had been displayed briefly at the gates, a grim warning to those who would attempt to restore the old tyranny. Fear had once reigned here, but a new rule, shaped by necessity and battered ideals, was taking root. As Stannis looked over the battlements one morning, he reflected on the improbable path he had taken. He was no beloved king, no figure of legend, but he had risked everything for a victory that many said was impossible. He had refused to cross a line that would have damned his soul, and in doing so, he had found something more valuable than a fleeting advantage. He had found the respect of men who might otherwise have deserted him. That intangible currency had led him to triumph on the field, forging alliances he never dreamed possible. He had not known it at the time, but in sparing Shireen, he had saved something essential in himself and ignited something essential in his followers. The flames Melisandre worshipped had proved less potent than the simple power of a father's love. The Watchers reported that the wildling refugees were massing near the wall, that Jon Snow had brokered a deal to let them settle. Stannis nodded thoughtfully. He would soon have to ride north, to treat with this new Lord Commander in person, forging an alliance that might be the realm's best hope against the terrors of winter. The notion still felt strange, treating with wildlings as allies. But he remembered the final words of Maester Aemon, the pleas from Davos that mercy was not a weakness. Perhaps this was the shape of the new order, like the forging of a sword in unknown fires. That evening, Stannis walked the corridors, coming to a stop before Melisandre's chamber. A faint red glow seeped out from beneath the door. He hesitated, remembering all the times her words had goaded him. He stepped inside. She stood by the hearth, gazing into the fire. She did not turn. "I saw you in the flames," she said softly. "You stand at the brink of destiny. A great darkness gathers to the north, and you shall face it. That is why Lawler has kept you here." Stannis watched the embers flicker, casting fleeting shadows on her face. "Keep your prophecies. I have work to do," he said curtly. But then his tone softened. "Your visions, did they not once say that only royal blood could break the snows? That Shireen had to be." Melisandre lowered her head, some glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "I misread the flames, or perhaps the Lord of Light offered us a choice. What was once demanded was set aside. Your decision shaped the world anew. For that I cannot say I regret my error." She turned, meeting his gaze. "Lawler's purpose is beyond my understanding. But I see now you have a role far greater than claiming one throne. You must defend the living. That duty eclipses all else." Stannis nodded, though he did not voice agreement or thanks. A short silence passed. "The north is secured for now," he said. "But come spring, if spring ever comes, I will march south to claim the Iron Throne. Too many false kings have sat on it." Melisandre inclined her head in a gesture that might have been acceptance or acknowledgement. "Winter is long, your grace, but it will pass. You have proven yourself worthy." He snorted, turning to leave. "Worthy or not, I have no choice. I am who I am." As he strode back into the cold corridors, he couldn't help but think that indeed he was still Stannis Baratheon, a man shaped by duty, haunted by regrets, striving for a justice that was always just out of reach. Yet he walked with renewed purpose. The north was under his rule, tenuous but real, and the future was open in ways he had never imagined. Outside, the snow drifted silently, veiling the scars of battle. In the courtyard, the men drank to their survival, and Shireen sat by the fire with a new friend, reading from a borrowed tome about the ancient kings. Overhead, the wind moaned across the towers, singing a lonely tune. So it was that Stannis Baratheon, the man known for unyielding will and grim justice, became the unlikely guardian of Winterfell, earning the grudging respect of the northern lords. By choosing to spare his only child from a horrific fate, he had anchored his men's faith and turned the tide of war, toppling the Boltons from their seat of terror. And though the snows would not relent, though the nights would grow darker still, he stood ready to face whatever came next. For if the cold winds were rising, bringing white shadows and whites, then the north would need a king who understood sacrifice, but not at the cost of his soul. In that uncertain dawn, the promise of a new era gleamed faintly, and for the first time in his hard life, Stannis Baratheon allowed himself to hope. Stannis Baratheon rose in the quiet hours before dawn, as he had done every day since his victory over House Bolton. Sleep had come fitfully at best. A king's bed was too soft for the weight of duty he carried, and though Winterfell now lay under his command, its ancient halls brought little solace. He had spent so long hardening himself against every discomfort that resting easily seemed foreign. The cold corridors and creaking timbers of this old stronghold offered only a subtle, persistent reminder of where he stood. The seat of House Stark felt neither wholly conquered nor truly his. Yet it was a place from which he could stare out at the drifting snow and think, with grim resolution, that at least he had seized a victory. Too many times, that victory might have slipped away, devoured by storms or undone by cruelty. He left his chamber, boots echoing against stone, and made his way to the courtyard. Guards saluted as he passed. Many wore furs over battered surcoats, the crowned stag of Baratheon sewn upon them. Others still displayed the red heart of the Lord of Light, though Stannis had insisted that was no official device of the realm, merely the badge of those who revered Lawler. Among them all were new faces, northern men who had answered his summons in the final days of the siege, folk from Bear Island, from the scattered hills east of the Dreadfort, or from the less heralded clans that roamed the foothills around the Wolfswood. They stood uncertainly yet dutifully, forced by the bleakness of the season to accept that Stannis Baratheon offered the best chance of something resembling order. No man could deny that the Boltons' tyranny had ended the moment Stannis' battered army stormed Winterfell, dethroning the flayed man. A hush blanketed the courtyard in these early hours. Torches on the walls flickered, their light swallowed by the lingering night. Ahead, dim lanterns in the stables revealed glimpses of the stable boys tending to the surviving horses. The night's wind had calmed. The air was biting cold, with a sharp clarity that chilled a man's lungs at every breath. Above, stars winked faintly in a sky that soon would lighten, though in winter the sun seemed never eager to rise. Stannis cast a glance toward the ramparts. The repairs the Boltons had made were shoddy, as if they'd never expected a protracted siege. In the weeks since capturing the castle, Stannis had ordered what repairs he could, shoring up portions of the wall that had begun to crumble, ensuring the guard towers were stocked with archers. Yet resources were scarce. Masonry required skilled laborers, and skilled laborers were in short supply. The winter threatened everyone, no matter who now wore the mantle of power. But still the wall stood, and the gate, once barred against him, now displayed his banners. No matter how uneasy his hold, that was an achievement he would not deny himself. Footsteps sounded behind him. He turned to see Ser Davos Seaworth, cloaked in heavy fur. The Onion Knight gave a small bow. "Your Grace," Davos said, quiet so as not to disturb the slumbering keep. "The watch reports all is calm through the night. No raiders. No signs of any Bolton remnants trying to reform." Stannis inclined his head. "Good," he said. Even that single syllable carried the weight of his grave timbre. There was little else to say on the matter. Most of the Bolton loyalists who had not bent the knee were now dead or scattered into the trackless wilderness. Some might still lurk, hidden in the deep snows, waiting for a chance to exact revenge. But the immediate threat was gone. "What of supplies?" he asked, turning toward Davos. Davos's mouth thinned with concern. "We ration the food, but the numbers have grown. More small folk trickle in every day, hoping for some measure of safety. And I fear some of the northern lords under our banner did not bring enough grain to share. They rely on the storerooms here, and we both know how meager these are." Stannis grunted. "We will not turn away those who come to us in good faith, but make it clear that idle mouths without service will not be tolerated. Everyone must contribute, whether it's clearing snow, gathering wood, or manning the walls. The winter is deep, and it will only grow worse." Davos acknowledged the command with a nod. In the flickering torchlight, one could see the lines on his face etched ever deeper, testaments to the relentless burdens. He seemed on the verge of voicing another concern but hesitated. Stannis, reading his knight's unease, pressed him with a curt gesture. Davos sighed. "We've received new ravens from the south. Word from King's Landing is muddled. Some say Tommen remains king, but the Lannisters scramble to hold power. Others speak of the Tyrells moving pieces of their own. There's talk of Dorne restive once more. Meanwhile, White Harbor remains quiet. Lord Wyman Manderley has not sent any official word beyond acknowledging your rule here at Winterfell. The Freys still linger along the White Knife, though none approach us openly." "Cowards," Stannis muttered. "They wait to see if I freeze or fail. They wait to see if the snows claim us, or if I can truly hold the north for a season. Then they will decide which side to join." "Aye, your grace," Davos said. "Also, I've heard it rumored that some men near the last river claim you plan to place a truce Stark in Winterfell if one can be found. The story grows each time it's told. Some say you have Ned S. Tark's daughter hidden away, or that you've discovered his long-lost son. It's only gossip for now." Stannis' face hardened, though not in anger at Davos. "If a living Stark emerges, the North will rally more wholeheartedly than it does now. But until then, they will have me. I will not repeat the mistakes of the Boltons. I rule by law, not by fear. Let that be enough." "Is it, though?" Davos asked gently, voice careful. "The Northern Lords are a proud people. They only yield so far to one they see as a Southron king. When the snows melt, or if they melt, they might test you in ways we can't yet foresee." Stannis turned away, facing the courtyard arch that led to the inner keep. "Let them test me. I've survived all else. For now, see to the day's tasks. We need more watchers on the eastern roads." If any wagons of supplies come from White Harbor or the mountains, I want them escorted safely through the passes. He paused, scanning Davos's expression. And be sure Shireen's tutors remain vigilant. She must be ready to step forward if I need her for negotiations. These lords may spurn me, but they will not spurn a princess who endured the same hardships they did. Davos bowed his head again, relief flickering in his eyes. The mention of Shireen reminded them both that she yet lived, that the darkest temptation had been cast aside. It will be done, your grace, he said, then departed into the gloom. Stannis allowed himself a breath. The memory of how close he had come to sacrificing Shireen still haunted him. It had almost seemed a necessity. Melisandre's flames had whispered that only royal blood could save the army from the storm. But he had chosen differently. The father in him had rebelled, and that paternal defiance had somehow become the pivot on which all else turned. The men followed him more loyally for it. The Bolton flank had collapsed against it, and now the north was his for the moment. He had not intended to tie his entire campaign to the life of a child, but that choice, one of the few truly human choices he had made in years, proved to be the bedrock of his success. A small glimmer of warmth stirred in his chest, though it was quickly snuffed out by the reality of what remained undone. The sky began to lighten from black to pewter, so Stannis returned inside. He passed through corridors hung with dire wolf banners that had once been cast aside for the flayed man. No more. The Bolton sigils had been stripped and burned, except where the stench of scorched cloth might have caused more harm than good in the damp. Where there had once been flayed men painted on the walls, they had hammered wooden planks to cover the gruesome images. In time, the planks would be removed, the walls properly scrubbed or replaced. For now, the memory of House Bolton was sealed away. Crossing through an antechamber, Stannis found himself near the solar that had once belonged to Eddard Stark. Now it served as a council room of sorts, though Stannis had not changed the battered furniture. No grand refurbishment was possible when the outer wards needed every resource. The door stood slightly ajar. He heard voices within, low, anxious. One voice belonged to Melisandre, intoning in that lilting accent from Ask Die. Another, younger voice was that of a man from Bear Island, complaining about the cold, or so it seemed. Stannis's brow furrowed. Melisandre's presence at dawn was hardly unusual, but who she was speaking to puzzled him. He stepped forward quietly, listening. The Lord of Light sees what is to come, Melisandre was saying. You must believe. The cold that we feel now is but a whisper of the true dark. I have seen shapes in the flames that would freeze a man's breath in his lungs. The snows will not relent, not truly, until the great other is driven back. Your red gods talk unsettles some men, came the Bear Islander's voice, reluctant but not entirely hostile. We see our own gods in the old weirwoods, the faces carved by our forefathers. We do not burn them. Melisandre's tone was quiet but steady. I do not ask you to betray the old gods. I ask only that you stand with the living against the coming storm. In this, our faiths may differ, but our cause is the same. Stannis chose that moment to push open the door. Both within turned at his entrance. The Bear Islander, clad in furs from head to toe, rose at once, offering a bow stiff enough to betray his discomfort. Melisandre inclined her head in the smallest of acknowledgments. Her red robe swirled about her in the faint breeze that followed Stannis inside. The large hearth in the corner burned too brightly for so early an hour. The air was hot, almost stifling. The shadows thrown by the flames made the walls seem to ripple. The Bear Islander cleared his throat. Your Grace, I was merely seeking solace from the Red Woman, Stannis finished curtly. Or answers. The snows do not spare those who ask politely for mercy. If you are expecting her fires to melt them away, you will be disappointed. Our victory came because men fought, not because we performed some bloody deed. He deliberately avoided mentioning the narrowness of that choice. The man stiffened, lowering his gaze. I seek only to understand how we are to survive if the winter worsens, Your Grace. We Bear Islanders know a harsh land, but rumor speaks of something more terrifying in the far north. Creatures of ice, dead men walking. The wildlings. I only hope we do not fight a war on two fronts. Stannis exhaled. That is exactly what we must avoid. Tell your Lady Mormont that I intend to treat with Jon Snow at Castle Black. The Night's Watch stands as our first line of defense against whatever lurks beyond the wall. We cannot afford old enmities now. The man looked relieved, as if this were news he had hoped to hear. Yes, Your Grace. I'll let her know. He cast a glance at Melisandre, then moved to the door. With a final bow, he departed. Stannis stood in the heat of the hearth, feeling sweat trickle along his scalp under the heavy cloak. He considered Melisandre with a stern expression. You find new converts everywhere you turn. Yet not all hearts burn as hot as you might wish. Melisandre's pale skin glistened in the firelight. "I am no septa or septon, your grace. I do not wander with a begging bowl, seeking worship. I speak only of what I see in the flames, and in the flames I see the north consumed unless we stand against it. Lawler is the Lord of Light, but even those who keep to the old gods will perish if they do not unite." Stannis gave a tight nod. "On that we agree. But let us do it without demanding they burn weirwood trees or do anything else that might stir up new rebellions. The north is restless enough." Her red lips curved in a faint smile. "Of course, your grace. My purpose remains what it has always been, to guide you." He turned away from the intensity of her gaze, crossing to the small table on which a spread of maps lay. One depicted the north in broad strokes: mountains, forests, the great rivers, and the wide gulf of the Bay of Ice. Small markers indicated holdfasts that had joined him or still resisted him. Few open foes remained. One marker for House Glover had been replaced with a neutral piece, as the Glovers were rumored to have retreated deeper into their lands, unsure whether to side with the new occupant of Winterfell. But they had not declared for the Boltons again, and that was something. Another marker hovered near White Harbor, representing House Manderly. For all Wyman Manderly's rumored rebellious streak, no open hostilities had emerged. Stannis' gaze flicked north to the wall. There was a vacant patch of land drawn in white above it. The Bay of Seals, the Frost Fangs, the unmapped realms from which the wildlings had fled. Jon Snow's name lingered in Stannis' mind. He had once offered Snow legitimacy, become Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, and rally the North. But the boy had refused, choosing his vows to the Night's Watch over the power of a crown. Stannis had resented it at first, but he had grown to respect it in his own gruff manner. Now that Stannis had Winterfell or some version of it, he wondered if the same offer might be renewed or whether that even mattered. The tide of events had changed. The White Walkers might not wait for genealogies to be sorted. Melisandre's voice broke his reverie. "Do you intend to ride to the wall yourself, your grace, or send an envoy?" "I will ride," Stannis said after a pause. "I cannot risk some underlings' misjudgment. Nor do I trust half the lords here not to sabotage the negotiation if it suits them. Jon Snow will speak more freely to me. He knows me, and he knows I mean what I say. But that leads to another question: can I leave Winterfell without inviting new chaos?" She considered him with that unreadable calm. "Ser Davos can manage your affairs in your absence. Many lords have accepted your justice. And the princess remains here. That will anchor their loyalty. They will not move against you while Shireen is within these walls." Stannis stiffened at the thought of leaving Shireen behind. He had only just saved her from the unspeakable, and the paternal corner of his heart rebelled at the notion of parting ways. But the king in him knew that physically taking her into the harsh north among wildlings and uncertain allies would be unwise. "Yes," he said, subdued. "She stays. But under guard. I will not have her safety left to chance." Melisandre gave a slow nod. "I shall watch over her, your grace. If that is your wish." He looked at her sharply. The memory of that day, the day she had spoken so casually of burning Shireen, flared in his mind. But that was done. He had refused. Still, he did not relish letting Melisandre linger close to the girl. "Ser Davos will watch over her," Stannis said brusquely, "along with men I trust. You may remain in Winterfell or accompany me, but you will not be her only guardian." Her eyes flickered with an emotion he could not place. Then she inclined her head. "As you say." Stannis eyed the old battered chairs, the smoke-stained walls, the quiet crackle of the fire. He knew his time to linger here was limited. His cause demanded vigilance, and the threat from beyond the wall was real. "Make ready, then. I mean to depart within a fortnight, once we secure more provisions. Davos will remain as castellan. If you ride with me, so be it. If you remain, I trust you to use your flames for the good of this garrison. No more talk of sacrifices. None. Do you understand?" She lifted her chin, the red gemstone at her throat gleaming with an inner fire. "I do." He gave her one final nod and turned on his heel, heading for the corridor and the day's business awaiting him. Behind him, the door thudded shut, leaving Melisandre with her flames. Days passed, and the rhythms of Winterfell settled into a steady, if tense, routine. The northern lords, those who had surrendered or come to Stannis in the final days of the siege, remained in the Great Keep, meeting often to discuss how best to distribute rations, how to protect the roads. Some still murmured about wanting to see a Stark in Winterfell, but their anger toward the Boltons muted any open rebellion against Stannis. The day's focus was survival. The nights were marked by the howling of distant wolves and the crackling of the torches around the courtyard. Snowfall came in intermittent waves, piling high against the gates. Men and horses trudged about doing their duties. Sentries in the guard towers kept watch, looking for any sign of riders or a fresh onslaught of winter that might bury them all. Shireen, with her timid smile and scarred cheek, became an unexpected presence in the daily life of the castle. She tried to greet the cooks in the kitchen, helped carry small items for the armorer, or sat in the library reading scrolls about the North's ancient legends. Most men who passed her would incline their heads, some with pity for the grayscale marks, others with genuine respect for a princess who had endured. She was still guarded, of course. Stannis had insisted on that. 2 men of the garrison, veterans from Dragonstone who had survived the march, followed her at a distance, ensuring no harm befell her. But she seemed unaware or unbothered by their protection. The small acts of kindness she showed softened even the hardest hearts among the northern folk. On a cold morning, a raven arrived from the Night's Watch. The scroll bore the black wax seal of the Lord Commander. Stannis took it in his solar, breaking the seal with stiff fingers. He read quickly, eyes flicking across the lines. Jon Snow's letter was brief. He wrote that the wildlings had passed the wall under a tenuous agreement, that the cold winds carried rumors of White Walkers stirring beyond the Frostfangs. And he extended an invitation for Stannis, as self-proclaimed king, to treat with him in the interests of the realm's defense. An arrow of satisfaction shot through Stannis. The boy had the sense to see that unity was required. Stannis would not have to force the meeting. He sent a swift reply, setting the date of his departure. Then he began finalizing the details of the journey. The chosen morning dawned clear but brutally cold. The sky was a pale gray, touched with streaks of color near the horizon, as though the sun were uncertain whether to rise in full force. It cast a weak light over the courtyard where the king's party was preparing to depart. Stannis wore a thick cloak of rough-spun fur, his armor beneath, a sword belted at his hip. Mounted on a dark gelding, he surveyed his small column, 200 mounted knights, half again as many archers on foot, plus pack horses loaded with provisions. Melisandre was astride a slender mare draped in red cloth, her robes fluttering like embers against the snow. The standard-bearer carried the crowned stag banner, though half the cloth was patched from the wear of the last campaign. Stannis's loyal men, battered and tested, formed up with a curt efficiency. No shining columns of cavalry, no polished steel. This was a force forged by hunger and cold, survival etched in every line of their faces. Ser Davos came forward, leading his horse by the reins. The Onion Knight wore a simpler cloak, patched in several places, his shortened fingertips visible when he removed his gloves to adjust the horse's bridle. He offered a deep bow to Stannis. "Your Grace, all is in readiness." Stannis gave a small nod. "You remain behind. I trust you above all others to see that no trouble stirs here. Keep the peace among these northern lords. If any conspire to re-raise the flayed man, cut them down." Davos's gaze flicked to Melisandre. "As you command, Your Grace. I will see to it." Melisandre said nothing, but a faint tilt of her head acknowledged that Davos would hold the reins of power in their absence. Stannis looked then to Shireen. She stood near the steps of the great hall, wrapped in furs so thick she seemed almost lost in them. Her sweet, scarred face had a solemn cast. She stepped forward, summoning courage. "Father," she said softly, "must you go so far?" "I must," Stannis replied, voice stiff. Emotions never came easily to him. The Night's Watch guards the wall, but they need aid, and we need their cooperation. The realm does not defend itself. He hesitated. The father in him wanted to say more, to reassure her. "I will return," he added almost awkwardly. She nodded, swallowing. "I'll do my lessons and help where I can." Ser Davos said, "Well," he said, "the men are grateful for any small kindness." Stannis reached out a gloved hand, resting it briefly on her shoulder. That was all the affection he could manage in front of his soldiers. "Listen to Davos and follow his words as you would mine." Another short pause. Then, in a voice quieter still, he said, "Be safe, daughter." She blinked and gave him a small, trembling smile. "Yes, father." He released her shoulder, beckoned to his standard-bearer, and kicked his horse to a walk. The gate yawned open, and the company filed out into the snow, hoofs crunching. Behind them, Winterfell's gate swung shut, leaving behind the hush of a dawn that had come too soon for comfort. Stannis led the march north, the wind tugging at his cloak, the breath of men and horses steaming in the cold. The journey to the wall was arduous. The roads were clogged with snowdrifts that the men had to clear or circumvent. At times, they passed through villages where battered small folk peered from behind shuttered windows, uncertain whether this was an army to welcome or fear. Stannis's men did not pillage, they offered the bare coin they had in exchange for bread or salted fish, though such exchanges were rare. Winter left little enough for peasants to spare. In some places, they found huts abandoned, the inhabitants having fled or starved. Grim silence accompanied them across the white expanse. Melisandre seldom spoke, though she would sometimes ride beside Stannis, gazing at the horizon. At night, she built small fires in the center of camp and whispered incantations. The men grew uneasy around her, but she took no more extreme measures. There were no demands for sacrifice, no cryptic pleas to Lawler that made men cringe. She remained a solitary figure, and some in the column half expected she might vanish if a particularly harsh wind blew. Yet she remained unwavering, her red cloak stark against the snow. After many days of trudging, they drew close to the wall. It loomed suddenly on the horizon like a vast, icy barricade that reached into the clouds. Even to men who had seen it before, the sight inspired awe. The wall of glacial ice, hundreds of feet high, cast a pale, ghostly reflection of the sky. At its base sat Castle Black, black stone buildings huddled in the perpetual shadow of the wall. Watchfires glimmered atop towers, their light dwarfed by the immensity of the ice. A wide field of hard-packed snow and gravel lay before the gates. Stannis led his party forward, announcing themselves at the perimeter. Black-cloaked sentries stood by, eyeing the arrivals with a guarded curiosity. Tension hung in the air, though the Boltons were gone from Winterfell. Many men of the Night's Watch recalled how Stannis had once demanded they bend the knee. Now he was here again, but in a different position. The gates swung open, revealing a bustle of black-clad brothers. Among them, the tall and solemn figure of Jon Snow stepped forward to greet him. Even if some in the castle yard murmured about Southerners or about old contentions, Jon Snow's voice rose calmly. "Your Grace," he said, bowing his head. The black cloak swept about him, the white dire wolf sigil stitched to his breast. "Welcome to Castle Black. The Night's Watch is honored by your visit." Stannis dismounted stiffly, joints aching from the cold ride. He handed the reins to one of his knights, stepping forward. He regarded Jon Snow with the same critical eye he gave to men on his war council. Snow had grown leaner, more taut with responsibility. He carried authority with that haunted look in his dark eyes. "Lord Commander," Stannis greeted him. "I have come to speak of the threat beyond the wall." Jon nodded, stepping aside to beckon Stannis in. "And the wildlings, as well as other matters. Please, your Grace, follow me. We have prepared a place for you and your men to warm themselves." Melisandre drifted along behind, her silent presence causing more than one black brother to shift uncomfortably. They still recalled how she had burned the wooden gods outside these very walls and how she had conjured illusions of a man named Mance Rayder. But Jon Snow only gave her a respectful, measured glance. He offered no comment to our presence. Castle Black was as rough as Stannis remembered, its buildings more serviceable than grand. Wooden walkways led between the structures, many in need of repair. Brothers hurried about their chores, some leading the newly arrived wildlings to tasks. Indeed, Stannis saw clusters of ragged wildling families, some with children, huddling near stables and outbuildings for shelter. Others carried weapons or went about in furs, uneasy in this southern outpost. The tension between the two groups, Night's Watch and wildlings, lay thick, but no open violence flared. Jon Snow had apparently enforced a truce. Inside the common hall, warmth assaulted them like a physical thing. Fires blazed in two great hearths, and benches lined the walls. A stout man with a steward's chain of office directed Stannis' knights to places where they could remove their cloaks and rest. Jon led Stannis and Melisandre to a table near the dais, gesturing for them to sit. The hall was not filled with men, only a few black brothers here and there. Most would be on their watch duties. "So," Stannis began once they were seated, "you've accepted thousands of wildlings through your gate." Jon nodded. "They'd have perished otherwise or joined the army of the dead. You yourself know the threat that looms." Melisandre listened with a distant expression, as if hearing words her flames had already told her. Stannis pressed on. "Yes, but the lords of the north scarcely share your eagerness to welcome them. Many have lost kin to wildling raids. This will not be easily accepted once the snows melt, if they ever do." Jon exhaled. "I know, but the alternative is far worse. We can't face the White Walkers scattered. The free folk call themselves free, but Winter and the others care nothing for freedom. This alliance is the only way we have a chance. That is why I asked you to come." Stannis regarded him levelly, arms folded. "I have seized Winterfell. I hold the seat of the North for now. The Boltons are dead. Yet even with that, many northern houses are reserved in their loyalty. If they see thousands of wildlings crossing their fields come spring, I risk open rebellion. I will keep them under the wall, contained, Jon assured him. I plan to disperse them along the gift. There is land enough for them to farm, if they are willing, but they must abide by certain rules. They cannot raid or cross beyond. Some of them will find that a hard chain to wear, but it is better than dying in the cold. Stannis's gaze shifted to Melisandre. She offered no direct comment. Then he looked back at Jon. If we do this, I need them, not as a plague upon my border, but as soldiers. The day may come when we fight an open war against these White Walkers. Will they stand with us? Jon hesitated. Some will. Their leader, Tormund Giantsbane, is a man of his word when it comes to fighting the dead. Others might prefer to hide. But if we treat them fairly, if we show them that our war is their war, we can gather a force bigger than either side alone. Stannis drummed his fingers on the table. The wood was scarred from years of rough usage. I'll not lie to you, Lord Commander. The lords of the North will be furious. But if it is the only way, I shall do what must be done. Still, the North is not wholly tamed. And what of your men here? Do they accept your choice? Jon's face grew taut. Not all of them. Some begrudge me for letting wildlings pass. We've had incidents. He seemed reluctant to elaborate, but Stannis understood well enough. Men do not forget old hatreds overnight. Yet the Night's Watch remains sworn to protect the realms of men, not to kill them needlessly. We have bigger enemies now. That is my argument, at least. Melisandre leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. And the others? You have seen them? Or the whites they command? Jon inclined his head. Some of us have. The wildlings brought tales of entire villages beyond the wall wiped out, corpses rising in the night. We have lost rangers to them. Dead men with blue eyes. They are real, my lady. And they will come for us all if we do not prepare. Stannis let out a slow breath. The talk of ice demons and whites had once felt like children's fables, but he had heard enough from those who swore otherwise. And he trusted that Jon Snow would not spin fantasies. I plan to hold the North, but I will not stand idle if these creatures emerge. My men are battered from the war with the Boltons. Many expected to march south for the Iron Throne in spring, but perhaps it is the opposite direction we must turn first. Jon's eyes flicked over to the door, where a swirl of cold air signaled new arrivals. Several black brothers came in, stamping snow off their boots. Then Jon turned back to Stannis. I am grateful for your aid, your grace. We cannot face them alone. But I must warn you, the North is vast, and the threat may come sooner or later than we think. We have precious little dragoglass left, only a few caches that Samwell Tarly discovered. If we are to fight the others, we'll need more. Steel alone won't stop them. Stannis grimaced. Dragonglass. Obsidian. I recall tales that Dragonstone, my old seat, sits on a trove of it. But that is leagues away, past Lannister-blocked roads or seas patrolled by foes. Not an easy solution. Jon nodded. We do what we can. We keep watch. We gather allies, both south of the wall and north, among the free folk. When the time comes, we stand as one, or we all fall. That is our reality. Melisandre's eyes glowed with an intensity born of prophecy. The flames have shown me that the power in the North gathers. If we do not unify, we will be swept away. But if we do, there is a chance, only a chance, but a real one, that light shall prevail over darkness. Jon looked at her. A flicker of unease crossed his face, remembering times she had spoken of king's blood, of sacrifices. A chance is all we need, he said quietly. Then to Stannis, my men will prepare quarters for you and your retinue. Shall we continue this in the morning, your grace? You must be weary from the road. Stannis inclined his head in acceptance, though he wore weariness like a private badge. Yes, we'll speak further. And tomorrow I wish to meet with this Tormund Giantbane. If I am to accept the wildlings along my borders, I will have words with their leader. Jon rose from the bench, offering a short bow. I will arrange it. Good night, your grace. Melisandre stood as well, but lingered by Stannis' side as Jon departed. The hall grew quieter, the fire snapping. Some men drowsed on benches or muttered in low tones. She glanced at the king. You see how quickly the winds shift. Once you sought to subdue the wildlings. Now you may fight alongside them. Stannis snorted. I do what I must. The North is no place for foolish pride. Survival is king. He frowned at her. There will be no talk of burning them. No demands that they forsake their own gods. Understood. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I have learned from your choice, your grace. Fear not. I do not need a sacrifice if men's hearts burn on their own with the fire of purpose. He made a rough sound that might have been agreement, then turned and left the hall, heading for the simple chamber the Night's Watch had prepared for him. 2 of his knights followed. Melisandre, unhurried, glided behind them. The night in Castle Black carried a different silence than at Winterfell. This was the frontier, the edge of the realm, where wind sang a mournful tune against the looming wall. Stannis found his bedchamber to be little more than a cramped cell with a straw mattress, but it would suffice. At least it was warmer than a tent in a snowstorm. That was enough. He slept fitfully, dreaming of a battlefield under swirling snow and a creature of ice glaring at him with blue, inhuman eyes. He swung his sword at it and the steel shattered. Another dream showed him Shireen standing on a parapet of Winterfell, beckoning him to come inside, but he was on the outside, battered by wind and hail. When he woke in the darkness, drenched in cold sweat, he muttered curses at himself. He was not a man prone to nightmares, his life was nightmare enough. But something about the far north played havoc with mortal souls. He rose, stoking the small brazier in the corner until the coals glowed, then wrapped himself in his cloak and tried to empty his mind. Morning arrived in a haze of pale light. Snow had fallen in the night, and men busily cleared the courtyard. Stannis rose, dressed, and met Jon Snow in the yard. The young Lord Commander stood with a group of Night's Watch officers, speaking with a tall, broad-shouldered wildling whose face was covered in a thick red beard. Tormund Giantsbane indeed. Stannis approached and Tormund turned, face splitting into a gap-toothed grin that showed more amusement than deference. "So this is the Southern King who saved the crows, eh?" Tormund said loudly so that all around could hear. "I half expected you'd have horns or a spiked tail, the way some of my folk talk." Stannis did not change expression. "I am Stannis Baratheon. You are Tormund Giantsbane. I have heard you style yourself Thunder Fist, Breaker of Ice, Tall Talker, Hornblower, and 100 more names. Are they all merited?" Tormund let out a rumbling laugh. "Likely not, but they keep the wind from getting stale. Let's just say I'm the man who led those who would follow me past your big wall." Jon Snow intervened gently, stepping between them. "Tormund has agreed to keep his people in line. No raids, no attacks on the Night's Watch or the North. They need land to settle, a chance to live. But they also know the others will not stop." Stannis studied Tormund. "If your folk remain peaceful, I will not march my men to slaughter you. But if they cross the gift to raid and pillage, you will answer to me. And I have no mercy for those who break faith. Do we understand each other?" The wildling's grin faded, replaced by a level, if still somewhat mischievous, stare. "I, Tormund, speak for my people. We've spilled enough blood fighting the crows. We're done with that if the crows are done as well. We only want to survive the cold. My folk are not all warriors, we have children, elders. We'll settle under your terms if those terms are fair." Stannis glanced at Jon, then back at Tormund. "Fair terms do not include raiding. That is final. But if you truly seek peace, you shall have it. In return, if war comes against these White Walkers, I expect your axes to join ours. If you run or turn cloaks, you are done." His tone was iron. Tormund arched a bushy brow. "We've seen what the dead can do, King. Don't worry about us running. We know what's at stake if your fancy lords do not." A short silence followed. Jon Snow, relief evident in his eyes, nodded to both men. "Good. Then let us seal this understanding." Stannis exhaled, grudgingly offering Tormund his forearm in a warrior's clasp. Tormund took it, his grip strong, and for an instant they stood locked in the swirling snow, a Southron king and a wildling chieftain forging an alliance that would have been unthinkable not long ago. Around them, Black brothers muttered, some with approval, some with deep misgivings. But no one moved to interfere. From across the yard, Melisandre watched, her red robes a splash of color against the pallid surroundings. A faint smile curved her lips as though the meeting confirmed some vision she had glimpsed. For better or worse, the realms of men were coming together. Of all the improbable alliances Stannis Baratheon had made, Stormcrows, Northern Houses, ex-Bolton men, this was perhaps the strangest. He found himself forging an understanding with a people once considered a savage enemy. The day passed in a flurry of meetings. Stannis spoke with more of the wildling elders, heard their grievances, and repeated his conditions. He conferred with Jon about the fragile state of the Night's Watch. Their numbers were too few, Jon admitted, to hold all the castles along the wall. Only Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower were properly manned. Stannis suggested that, once matters were more settled in the north, he might send a contingent of men to help guard those strongholds. But that would depend on the North's acceptance. He was not yet sure how the lords would react to his new pact with the wildlings. That evening, Stannis took a meager supper in the company of a few Black brothers and Melisandre. Jon Snow had duties to attend, so he did not linger. The hall smelled of boiled cabbage and pork stew, a humble fare indeed. Yet Stannis ate it without complaint, mindful that the Night's Watch lived under harsh conditions. As they finished, Melisandre murmured, "I see the shape of unity forming. Now the true question remains. Will the North follow you against the others, or will they cling to old grudges?" Stannis dabbed at his mouth with a threadbare cloth. "I cannot say. The Mormonts, the Umbers, some have no love for wildlings, but they have less love for the Boltons. If I can present the others as a real threat, if ravens come from the wall describing wights and horrors in the night, some will stand with me. They remember the old tales." Melisandre lowered her voice. "But not all. Some men would rather fight each other than unite, even if it dooms them." Stannis's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then they will learn the cost of disunity." When at last the day's councils finished, Stannis found a bunk in a drafty corridor. He settled under rough blankets, mind churning with half-formed plans. If the threat was truly as dire as Jon Snow believed, the Southern War for the Iron Throne might have to wait. He could not march an army south if the White Walkers poured over the wall. Yet the notion of leaving King's Landing to the Lannisters gnawed at him. He thought of his brother Robert, of the rightful inheritance he believed had been stolen by the bastard children of Cersei. All that had driven him to raise his banners in the first place. Duty, law, justice. Was it all to be overshadowed by a threat older than the Seven Kingdoms themselves? He clenched his jaw. A king's duty was to the realm, not his personal ambition. If the realm would be lost to an army of the dead, then no crown meant anything. Still, it stung his pride to set aside the matter of the Iron Throne. One step at a time, he told himself. Survive the winter, unite the North, stand against the White Walkers, then the South, then the throne. But the list felt endless, like a staircase vanishing into dark clouds. He drifted into uneasy sleep, haunted once more by images of creeping ice and swirling snow, as though a million silent ghosts marched on the edge of sight. At some point he woke, hearing distant voices, arguing or shouting. He bolted upright, reaching for the knife at his belt. The corridor outside his door was dimly lit by a single torch. He heard men's footsteps running, the scuff of boots against wood. Stannis yanked the door open, stepping out into the corridor in nothing but his breeches and a cloak thrown hastily around him. Two black brothers were rushing by. They skidded to a halt at the sight of him. "Your Grace," one panted. "Some of our men are brawling with wildlings in the yard. Started with an insult or a stolen trinket. I'm not sure. Lord Commander Snow is already trying to stop it, but it's spreading." Stannis scowled. Even here, even now, men could not keep the peace. He barked, "Lead me there." He followed them through winding corridors, emerging into the courtyard to find a cluster of black brothers and wildlings grappling, shouting curses, brandishing knives or clubs. A few bodies lay in the snow, some moving, some not. The wind howled, scattering flurries around the struggling figures. Jon Snow was in their midst, bellowing for calm. A handful of Night's Watch officers tried to pull men apart. Tormund stomped around, roaring at his own folk to stand down, but tension was high. Stannis stormed forward, ignoring the slipperiness underfoot. He waded into the fray, voice booming. "Enough! Stand down!" He seized a wildling man by the scruff, hauling him away from a brother he was throttling. Another Night's Watchman turned, saw Stannis, and hesitated, dropping his makeshift club. Jon Snow lunged between two fighting men, knocking them aside. Tormund shoved one of his own, nearly sending the fellow sprawling. Slowly, the swirl of violence receded, men retreating or collapsing from exhaustion. In that moment, Stannis realized it had been more than a minor spat. Someone had used steel. 3 men lay on the ground, bleeding. Jon knelt by one, pressing a hand to the wound, his face etched with anger and concern. Tormund crouched near another, cursing under his breath. The rest glared at each other across a few scattered yards of bloodied snow. The tension hummed in the cold air. Another spark could reignite the brawl in an instant. Stannis forced his voice into iron calm. Who started this? Silence fell. Men eyed each other, some pointing accusingly. At last, one black brother spat. He took my coin purse, the wildling filth, tried to slip off in the shadows. I caught him in the act. A wildling woman brandished a bone knife. He was cheating at dice, Crow. You refused to pay what you owed. Said it was our fault your luck was rotten. They shouted at each other again, forcing Stannis to raise his voice. Enough! We do not have time for these squabbles. Lord Commander Snow, take them into custody or do whatever you must. This is your castle, but do not let this spread. If any man tries to break the peace again, I'll see him hanged. Jon rose, his gloved hands stained with the blood of the man he had tried to help. The wounded brother moaned softly. Aye, your grace. Gather up the brawlers. Jon ordered his men. The black brothers advanced, forcibly separating men from both sides, ignoring protests. Tormund helped restrain a wildling who still spat curses. Soon the worst offenders were marched off to a makeshift cell. The wounded were carried to the maester's chamber. In the aftermath, the courtyard lay quiet, marred by patches of red. Stannis stared at the blood, fury simmering beneath his stern mask. The uneasy alliance was so fragile that a single stolen coin purse could bring about fresh violence. Jon, breathing hard, looked to Stannis. My apologies, your grace. Tensions are high. Some of my men lost brothers in wildling raids. Some of the wildlings lost kin to the Watch's arrows. Save it. Stannis cut him off. We must be vigilant. If more of these incidents occur, all our talk of unity will be for naught. Enforce discipline, or you'll have a mutiny on your hands. Jon nodded grimly. Yes, your grace. Tormund stomped over, face thunderous. I told them to keep their fists to themselves. But old grudges die slow, especially when drink is involved. He glanced around, noticing the men with torches and crossbows who had come running. I'll talk to my folk. We'll sort out who started it, who was only defending themselves. But you Crow-King lords need to keep your crows in line as well. Jon bridled at the tone but kept his voice steady. We will. Just see to your people. Or we'll have more than words next time. Tormund huffed. Aye. He stormed off to corral the remaining wildlings, who dispersed with hostile stares at the men in black. The courtyard began to empty. The cold wind whistled across the bloody patches, turning the fallen snow a sickly pink. Night pressed down as the last torches flickered. Stannis lingered only a moment longer, scowling at the futility of men's tempers, before returning to his cramped chamber. Sleep, he would be scarce now. The next day brought more counsels. Jon Snow had half a mind to expel certain troublemakers from Castle Black entirely, but Tormund argued that exiling them would only turn them into bandits on the other side of the wall, or worse, push them into the arms of the others. Stannis listened, feeling his own frustration mount, but he recognized that every compromise demanded a step away from the old ways. If the wildlings were to be integrated, they needed an outlet, tasks, structure, things they had never known. The Watch needed men disciplined enough to see the bigger picture. Resolving all of that would take time. Time was a luxury they might not have. Stannis soon came to realize that lingering too long at Castle Black might do more harm than good. If the North heard rumors of wildlings mixing freely with crows and a Southron king, many might decide the entire arrangement was an abomination. Instead, Stannis determined to return to Winterfell to keep order among the lords and from there, funnel aid to the Watch if needed. He left behind a small detachment to finalize any arrangement Jon might require. Before departing, he and Jon parted on sober but respectful terms, each acknowledging the precarious future. Tormund offered a gruff farewell as well, though with no particular ceremony. The journey back to Winterfell was every bit as harsh. More snow had fallen, covering the roads in fresh drifts. A biting wind hounded them day and night. Melisandre bore it with the same eerie composure as always, never complaining, always observing. A few of the men in Stannis' column succumbed to frostbite or fell sick, forcing the company to make camp for longer than planned. But eventually, the crenellated walls of Winterfell appeared on the horizon again. Smoke rose from its chimneys, and from the outer wards came the faint sounds of men drilling in the yard. They entered to find Ser Davos already dealing with a small crisis, a dispute between some Umbers and Karstarks who had traded accusations of theft. But upon seeing Stannis, the parties fell quiet, each eager not to provoke the king's wrath. Davos reported that no major rebellions had stirred in his absence, though the Manderleys remained aloof, ignoring invitations to send men or supplies. The Glovers had reluctantly declared their acceptance of Stannis's new rule with letters carried by a trembling courier. And Lady Lyanna Mormont, child though she was, had sent a curt message reaffirming that House Mormont recognized only a king in the north named Stark, but that they would not move against Stannis for now, so long as the Boltons stayed dead. Stannis accepted these mixed tidings with equanimity. At least the snows had not buried them entirely. He summoned Shireen and, seeing her safe and well, felt a knot of tension in his chest relax. She bowed in that endearingly stiff manner she had, smiling shyly. Tending to 1,000 smaller matters came next. Hearing petitions, allotting rations, ensuring the watch rotations were maintained. Every hour, men brought him problems. But better that than the deafening silence of a collapsed realm. Soon enough, the weather locked Winterfell in a near-constant state of siege by the elements. The walls of the keep drifted high with snow, and the nights grew so cold that even the thickest fires seemed to do little. The men had to ration their firewood carefully, lest they run out before spring. Some of the outbuildings had been turned into shelters for small folk who had come seeking safety. Children played in the yard, their breath billowing in clouds, clad in rags or borrowed cloaks. Sometimes Shireen joined them, her guards trailing. She never complained, not even when the bitter cold made her cheeks sting. Her courage was quiet, but it set an example that touched men hardened by war. Stannis realized, as the weeks crept by, that he was not just holding Winterfell, he was learning to rule it, maintaining alliances, distributing justice, listening to the complaints of lords whose pride rankled at being subservient to a Baratheon. Always, he reminded them that the Boltons were gone only because his army had bled in the snow. Some argued that House Stark should be restored. Stannis always countered that, until a Stark could be found, the North needed a caretaker. And if the rumors of Rickon or Bran or Arya Stark proved true, let them come forward. He would see them recognized. But no word arrived of the living Starks, so the uneasy status quo endured. Melisandre continued her prayers in the Godswood, though it was a weirwood godswood. Men whispered that she meant to burn the heart tree, but she never did. Instead, she stood among the red leaves, chanting low incantations. Once, Davos confronted her. He demanded to know what she sought there. She responded only that the old gods and R'hllor alike bore witness to the same great conflict, and that men should be united under any banner that repelled the cold darkness. Davos did not entirely trust her, but at least she demanded no more children's lives. Occasionally, ravens came from Castle Black, bearing updates. Jon Snow's messages spoke of slow progress with the wildlings, repeated skirmishes that had to be quelled, and sightings of whites beyond the wall. No major attacks yet, but a growing sense of dread. Stannis shared the messages with the Northern Lords, so they might see the truth. Some believed, others scoffed. Even fear could not unite men instantly. One gray afternoon, as Stannis stood on the ramparts, surveying the bleak plains, he heard the distant horn call of a rider approaching. Men at the gate shouted news of a small party from White Harbor. Stannis felt a surge of anticipation. Perhaps Wyman Manderley had finally deigned to appear, or had sent an envoy. He descended the spiral stairs, passing torches guttering in iron sconces, until he reached the courtyard. The gates opened, letting in a half-dozen riders in Manderley livery. At their head was a rotund man with thinning white hair and a trim beard. Not Wyman Manderley himself, but one of his cousins or a lesser knight. The man dismounted stiffly and bowed low to Stannis. "Your Grace," the envoy said, breath misting in the cold, "I come on behalf of Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbor. He sends greetings and regrets that he has been slow to respond. Urgent matters have constrained him, but we have heard that you hold the North and that the Boltons are no more." Stannis nodded curtly. "They are not. Roose and Ramsay Bolton lie in their graves. What does Lord Wyman want of me?" The envoy offered a small, careful smile. "White Harbor is beset with the usual winter burdens. Food is scarce and the sea lanes are threatened by iron-born raiders. Lord Wyman hopes we might reach an understanding. In exchange for certain concessions, protection along the White Knife, trade privileges, he may pledge a fuller support to your cause, your grace." Stannis' mouth tightened. He suspected Manderley was leveraging him, trying to pick the time to come forward for maximum benefit. But it was not the moment for pride. If Lord Wyman truly wishes to stand with me, he will send men and ships to assist in the defense of the realm. We have a war to the north that cannot be ignored. The envoy bowed again. "I shall relay your words. Lord Wyman has also asked me to humbly invite you or your delegates to White Harbor, should it please you to treat in person." A hush fell. Stannis weighed the notion. Traveling to White Harbor in winter would be perilous, especially with uncertain allegiances. But if securing Manderley's support strengthened his hold, it might be worth the risk. He recalled that the Manderleys were once loyal to House Stark and they loathed the Boltons for the Red Wedding. Perhaps with the flayed man banished, they would indeed rally. "I will consider it," he said at length, and dismissed the envoy to a warm meal and a bed in the keep. The talk of Ironborn raiders also gnawed at him. The North's coasts were vast and poorly defended, especially now. If the Ironborn struck from the sea, they could wreak havoc on supply lines. Another threat to juggle. That night, in the privacy of his chamber, Stannis discussed the matter with Ser Davos. The Onion Knight pointed out that White Harbor was crucial if they were to have any sort of naval presence in the north. If winter storms abated, ships from White Harbor could trade with the Vale or even across the Narrow Sea. And if we ever do march south, Davos concluded, we would do well to have the Manderleys at our side. They are the wealthiest house in the north, next to the Boltons. Stannis stood by the hearth, arms folded. "Yes. Then I must treat with them or send an envoy who can manage the discussion as I would. But I am reluctant to leave Winterfell again. The lords are only just settling into submission." Davos hesitated. "Then send me, your grace. I have negotiated with lords in worse circumstances. If Lord Wyman truly hates the Boltons, as rumor says, he should have no quarrel with you unless he means to champion the Stark name. But I can handle that. And if it proves a trap, well, better me than you." Stannis studied him in silence. He saw the loyalty etched in Davos's face, the willingness to do whatever was necessary. At last he nodded. "Very well. You shall go, but take a proper escort. I will not have you murdered on the road by bandits or stray Bolton men." Davos's lips twitched in a faint smile. "As you command, your grace." Thus did Stannis begin the next round of diplomatic maneuvers. While Davos prepared to ride to White Harbor, Stannis reinforced the gates and walls of Winterfell, ensuring no surprise assault could catch him unawares. Melisandre approved of caution, though her gaze often strayed north, where she claimed the real danger lay. Shireen continued her quiet life in the keep, sometimes reading by the hearth in the great hall, sometimes walking in the courtyard with a pair of guards. She never strayed beyond the walls. Stannis insisted on that. One gray afternoon, as snow drifted lazily, Shireen found her way to the old godwood. Its weirwood glowed with a pale, eerie light in the gloom. The carved face in the trunk seemed to watch her with ancient, unblinking eyes. A hush hung about the place, broken only by the soft rustle of the red leaves. Melisandre stood near the tree, cloaked in red. Shireen approached hesitantly, uncertain whether she was intruding. The red woman turned, the slightest smile on her lips. "My lady princess," Melisandre said in a voice hushed as if mindful of the old gods. "What brings you here?" Shireen fidgeted with her gloves, tucking her scarred cheek behind the fur trim of her cloak. "I was reading about the old gods and the first men, and I wanted to see the weirwood tree. It's so old." Melisandre's eyes flicked to the carved face. "Older than we can fathom. Some in the north believe these trees watch and remember. Do you believe that, child?" Shireen glanced at the carved mouth, half open as though in silent lament. I don't know. But the old gods, the new gods, the seven, the red god, sometimes it's all confusing." A gentle smile curved Melisandre's lips, unexpected in its warmth. "Faith can be confusing. I have spent many years learning the mysteries of Lawler, but even I do not pretend to understand everything. One truth remains, the darkness is real and we must stand against it." Shireen lowered her gaze, remembering the close call she had with that darkness. Darkness means the cold, the White Walkers? Or something else? Melisandre's expression flickered. "All manner of evils lurk in the dark, child. But yes, for now, the cold is our enemy. The snows, the ice, the whites." She paused. "Yet you were saved from a terrible fate. Perhaps that is a sign we may yet win." Shireen shifted uncomfortably. She knew enough never to speak of how her father had almost. She swallowed, uncertain what to say. Melisandre must have noticed her turmoil, for she extended a hand as if to reassure her. Shireen hesitated, then took it. The red woman's skin felt strangely warm despite the cold air. "There is power in you," Melisandre murmured, not in the old seductive manner of wanting to burn her, but in a quieter recognition. "You carry royal blood, yes. But you also carry something more precious, your father's mercy. That child may be the greatest weapon we have. Men rally to those who show them kindness." Shireen blinked, uncertain. "But father isn't always kind." A brief laugh, soft as a breeze. "Not in the trivial sense, no. But he chose love over cruelty once, and it changed everything. Remember that." They stood there in the quiet godwood, the silence unbroken except for the slow drip of melting snow from the red leaves. Shireen felt an odd sense of comfort standing by Melisandre under the ancient eyes of the weirwood. For all her fears, for all the nightmares she'd had, she was alive. Her father was alive. House Baratheon still stood. And perhaps that counted for something in a world overshadowed by war and winter. In the days that followed, Ser Davos departed for White Harbor with an escort of 24 men. The roads were dangerous, but they carried enough supplies to last. Stannis hoped for a swift resolution. Meanwhile, he continued to solidify his hold on the north, ensuring that any pockets of Bolton's sympathizers were snuffed out or brought to heel. Scouts roamed the countryside, returning with reports of black wolves prowling in large packs, possibly dire wolves. Some men whispered it was a sign that the blood of House Stark lived on, that the old gods were stirring. Stannis disregarded such talk, but the sightings made him uneasy. Letters arrived from distant corners. A handful of mountain clans pledged a grudging loyalty, praising Stannis for killing the Boltons. They asked only to be left alone in their high valleys. Stannis agreed. He had no interest in a fruitless fight among the peaks, especially when spring might bring the real war to their door. From the south, news came that King's Landing remained in turmoil. The Lannisters struggled to maintain control while the Tyrells pressed for more influence. Dorne was restive. Stannis felt a momentary pang that, in another life, he would have seized the chaos as an opportunity. But the north demanded all his attention now. Weeks stretched into more weeks. Winter's relentless grip showed no sign of loosening. At times, the drifts outside Winterfell rose nearly to the top of the gatehouse. Crews of men had to hack and shovel through the ice to keep an open path. Rations dwindled and hunts brought back scant game. The castle cellars had once been well stocked, but the Boltons had taken their share, and then Stannis' army had consumed more during the siege and after. Even careful rationing left the men hungry. Morale dipped, yet no one deserted. Stannis' personal presence, his forbidding glare, and the memory of how he had freed them from the Boltons kept them in line. Shireen fell ill one bitter night, coughing and trembling with fever. Maester Tybalt, appointed by Stannis after the old Maester of Winterfell had vanished, hurried to her side, administering herbal remedies. Fear lanced through Stannis when he learned of it. He rushed to her chambers, ignoring the concerned protests of his knights. Inside, he found Shireen pale and sweating beneath layers of blankets. Her eyes opened when she sensed him. She managed a small smile. "Father, I'm all right. The Maester says it's just a chill." Stannis' throat felt tight. He laid a rough hand on her brow. She was hot to the touch. "Rest," he said softly. "You will recover." She coughed again, a ragged sound. "Yes, I want to read my book soon. I need to finish learning about the northern houses." He forced a thin smile. "You will read them all. When you're well." The memory of how close he had come to letting her burn gnawed at him like a living thing. Had he done that monstrous deed, he would not now be able to stand at her bedside, urging her to fight a simple fever. The weight of it threatened to crush him. He turned to Maester Tybalt. "See that she recovers. Whatever you need, you shall have." The Maester nodded, bowing. "Certainly, your grace. I believe with rest and warm broth, she will be well in a few days." Shireen's fever broke the next night, leaving her weak but stable. Stannis sat vigil outside her chamber, ignoring the demands of the castle, letting Davos's stand-in handle the day's lesser tasks. When Shireen finally managed to sleep soundly, the tension in Stannis' chest eased and he allowed himself a few hours of fitful rest. No crown in the world, he realized, mattered as much as her survival. She had become, in many ways, a symbol not only for his men, but for him, a living testament to the line he would not cross again. As winter wore on, word arrived from Ser Davos in White Harbor. A single raven carried a message. Negotiations were delicate, but proceeding. Lord Wyman Manderley wanted assurances that Stannis would respect White Harbor's trade privileges, that he would not hamper their faith in the Seven, and that he might someday restore House Stark. Stannis penned a curt but accommodating reply, stating that White Harbor would have the protections and freedoms it required, so long as it acknowledged his authority until or unless a true Stark heir emerged. The back and forth continued, slow as glaciers. Each exchange of ravens took days, sometimes weeks, depending on the storms. Melisandre, for her part, seemed more subdued. She no longer pronounced fiery visions of unstoppable triumph. Instead, she spent much time in the godwood or by the braziers in the great hall, gazing into the flames. Men who passed her swore they saw flickers of dread in her eyes. She had once believed Stannis to be Azor, a High Reborn, the chosen champion of Lawler who would defeat the Great Other. Now she spoke less of that, more of the necessity of uniting all men to face the cold. Stannis wondered if she questioned her faith or if she simply read the future differently now. Either way, she said little of it to him. Perhaps the memory of how he had defied her over Shireen still lingered. The tension in Winterfell rose as rations grew short. Minor scuffles broke out in the yard or in the corridors, often over trivial matters. A man accused another of stealing a piece of bread or hogging the warmth of a particular fire. Stannis imposed strict discipline, ordering lashings for theft, short confinement for brawling. Yet underlying it all was a sense of grim solidarity. They had come this far together. Could they endure until spring? One evening, a messenger arrived from Castle Black. The man was half dead with exhaustion, snow-caked and trembling. He brought a letter from Jon Snow sealed in black wax. The contents were brief but chilling. White Walkers had been sighted by rangers in the haunted forest. An entire wildling village had gone silent, with footprints of whites found in the snow. The Watch was preparing for the worst. They begged Stannis to send any men he could spare, or at least to stand ready if the Walkers breached the wall. Stannis read the letter twice, his jaw set. He summoned his war council, such as it was, to the Great Hall. There, in the glow of the hearth, flanked by knights and northern lords, he outlined the crisis. The threat we spoke of is no longer distant rumor, he said, voice echoing off the walls. The White Walkers march. The Night's Watch is badly outnumbered. If the wall falls, all the north falls. A cold hush fell. Some of the older northern lords glanced at each other, faces pale. The old tales had come alive, it seemed. One man coughed, then Poke. Your Grace, do you propose we ride north and face them? Stannis's eyes swept the hall. We must defend the wall if it is threatened, or at least reinforce it. If I strip Winterfell of men, we risk losing our hold here. But if we do nothing, and the Watch collapses, it won't matter who holds Winterfell when the dead come. The men shifted, uneasy. Some voiced concerns that House Glover or House Manderly might take advantage if the castle was left vulnerable. Others insisted the real war was north. The arguments swirled. Stannis let them speak, arms folded, face cold. At last he raised a hand for silence. We will not abandon Winterfell, he declared, nor will we abandon the Watch. I will form a force of able-bodied men who can march. Others will remain to garrison the castle. The time for bickering is ended. No one dared defy him openly. They grumbled, but the reality was clear. If the White Walkers were real, and the Watchers on the wall said they were, then no fortress in the north would be safe once the others streamed past the wall. It was better to fight them there, where the wall's magic might yet hold, than to let them roam freely. In the days that followed, men prepared. Stannis ordered every spare scrap of metal reforged into weapons. Arrows were fletched, spear points sharpened. A handful of dragonglass daggers had been found in Winterfell's crypt, hidden among old curiosities. No one knew how they got there. Melisandre seemed quietly fascinated by them. They would be given to the scouts in case steel failed. The realm had little enough knowledge of how to fight the White Walkers, but they would have to make do. Rumors abounded that the men would soon see an army of whites, rotting corpses with blue eyes that did not feel pain. Stannis heard them talk, saw the fear in their eyes. He responded with measured stoicism, reminding them that steel and discipline had won the day against the Boltons. Perhaps they believed him, or perhaps they only pretended to. But enough confidence lingered that the army began to form up. Foot soldiers from the Stormlands who had marched with him, mercenaries from the Stormcrows who had not deserted, northern levies forced to accept his rule, ex-Bolton men who had bent the knee rather than be executed. All marched under the crowned stag, forging a curious unity. Shireen came to him one evening as he paced near the hearth, going over rosters. She asked in a small, tremulous voice, "Father, will you be leaving again?" He looked up from the parchment. "Yes," he said. "I must. The Watch needs me." She swallowed, eyes dark. I want you to come back. Promise me." Stannis was silent for a long moment. Such promises were seldom wise for a man of war. Yet he saw the fear in her eyes, the recollection of all she had nearly lost. "I promise," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "I will do all in my power to return." He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling how fragile she was under the wool. "You must be strong here as you have been. Help keep the peace in my absence." A tear glistened at the corner of her eye, but she blinked it away and nodded. "I will, Father." He wanted to say more, something reassuring, something fatherly, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he rested his forehead lightly against hers, a rare moment of closeness. Then he drew back. "Stay safe, daughter." When the day came, it was as bleak as any. Snow drifted down in lacy flurries. Stannis stood in the courtyard with his chosen host. 1,000 men, give or take, the most he could spare while leaving Winterfell guarded. At his side rode knights in patched armor, lords from the north who had swallowed their misgivings, and Sellswords who wanted their pay. They carried banners tattered by winter storms. Melisandre, again, rode near him, though he had not demanded her presence. She had insisted. She said the fires of R'hllor would be needed if the White Walkers came. Stannis had not argued. Ser Davos had not yet returned from White Harbor, so Stannis left command of Winterfell to a few trusted lords. One from the Crownlands, one from Bear Island, and one of the Karstarks who had proven loyal. He gave final orders that Shireen be guarded, that the rations be carefully allotted. Then, without further ceremony, he led the column out the gates. Once again, the sound of hooves crunching on snow echoed in the frigid air. They marched north. Each day was a battle against the elements. Men stumbled into drifts, horses faltered on icy ground. The nights were an ordeal of bitter cold, with only feeble fires to keep the frost at bay. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that if the wall fell, there would be no refuge anywhere. Stannis' face grew more drawn, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, yet his will remained unbroken. He had begun this entire campaign thinking only of the Iron Throne. Now, the looming threat of an undead horde overshadowed every earthly crown. On the 11th day of travel, their scouts encountered a band of wildlings led by one of Tormund's lieutenants. They reported that the others had been sighted not far from Eastwatch, that the nights beyond the wall echoed with inhuman cries. Stannis pressed the march harder. He felt the men's fear grow. Some muttered that they would soon face a foe who could not die. But he told them all the same, "We must fight or we perish. Your children, your wives, your lords. None will live if we do not stand." Grim though it was, it gave them purpose. At last, the looming wall appeared again, its icy ramparts glimmering in the half-light of a sun that never seemed to truly rise. Smoke from Castle Black's fires signaled life. Stannis' army approached, stirring the watchers atop the battlements. Horns sounded. They were expected. But what they found within the castle walls was a scene of desperate preparation. Jon Snow and his black brothers mustered what men they could, including wildlings, to stand watch. Eastwatch had sent frantic messages that whites prowled near the frozen shore. The Shadow Tower was too few in number to send help. Stannis ordered his men to make camp outside Castle Black, bridging the gap between the fortress and open ground. They would keep the perimeter secure, send out patrols. Word had come that the others might try to strike from multiple directions. Melisandre gazed north with an unreadable expression. The nights came swiftly now, lasting long hours. The flickering torches and watchfires threw wild shadows against the ice. Jon Snow met Stannis in the yard. The young Lord Commander's face was drawn with fatigue. "They're close," Jon said, voice low. "Rangers have spotted whites less than a half-day's ride from the wall, but they vanish like ghosts, as if testing us." Stannis nodded curtly. "Then we do not wait for them to strike. We patrol beyond the wall. If we find them, we burn them. The old tales say they hate fire." Jon hesitated. "A risky move. We could be drawn into an ambush. My rangers are few." Stannis surveyed the men in black, the wildlings armed with spears and axes, and his own ragged soldiers. "We have numbers now. We can drive them back at least for a time, or force them to reveal themselves. Prepare your best trackers. We march at dawn." Jon gave a resigned nod. "I'll see it done." That night, in the darkest hours, Stannis walked the ramparts. A savage wind tore at him, stinging his face and ears. He looked out over the moonlit snows, a white desert that glimmered under the moon's pale light. Somewhere out there, the others lurked, silent as death. The king found no comfort in the distant glare of the night sky. The stars seemed pitiless, the moon a cold eye observing mortal struggles from afar. He thought of Shireen safe behind Winterfell's walls. Safe for now. If he failed here, there would be no safety left in the world. Clenching his jaw, he pulled his cloak tighter. Fear was an enemy as potent as any White Walker. He would not yield to it, no matter the cost. Below, men tended fires, lumps of black amid swirling flakes. Across the yard, Melisandre stood by a brazier, chanting under her breath. The flames danced, throwing fleeting reflections on the ice behind her. Stannis guessed she sought glimpses of the future, but whether she found them, she did not say. He made his way down the stairs, determined to rest a few hours before dawn. The final watch had begun, and the war for the living was at hand. When the dawn arrived, cold, gray, loveless, Stannis and Jon led a force of rangers, wildlings, and Baratheon soldiers beyond the wall. They moved carefully, scanning every hollow and drift. The world felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the wind dared not stir. Snow crunched underfoot. The wildlings carried torches alongside steel, a wise precaution. Their breaths plumed in the freezing air, forming ghostly shapes. For hours, they marched, seeing little but endless white, skeletal trees and frozen streams. A gloom settled over them, though the sun hung overhead. Then the forward scouts signaled. Stannis rode to the front with Jon. They saw footprints in the snow, strange, dragging tracks, as if made by lifeless limbs. A hush spread through the column. Men muttered prayers to the Seven, to the old gods, to R'hllor. Stannis's hand clenched on his reins. This was it. Suddenly, a scream erupted from the flank, sharp and piercing. Stannis wheeled his horse to see half a dozen shapes lurching out of the frosted trees. Bodies gaunt and pale, their eyes lit with blue fire. Whites. They tore into the men at the edge of the column, skeletal hands scrabbling, jaws snapping. Steel rang out as soldiers fought back. One white seized a soldier by the throat, and even as the man stabbed it, the creature did not stop until a torch was thrust in its face, sending it reeling back in a burst of foul smoke. The column erupted in chaos. More whites emerged from behind drifts, from beneath the snow, rising in a mockery of life. Some wore tattered clothing from who knew what era. Some were half-rotted. Screams and shouts filled the air. Jon Snow bellowed for men to stand firm, form ranks. Wildlings hollered, swinging axes. Baratheon knights tried to regroup, horses panicking at the stench of death. Stannis drew his sword, driving his horse forward to hack at a white that had pinned one of his soldiers. The sword bit deep, shearing the creature's spine, but its upper half still clawed the man's leg until another soldier burnt it with a torch. It was an ambush. More of them poured in from the treeline, dozens, then scores, far more than the scattered reports had suggested. The men fought bravely, but the whites did not feel pain or fear. One Baratheon knight was pulled off his horse by three of them, screaming as they tore into him. A wildling woman slammed her torch into a white's face repeatedly until it collapsed in a flurry of ash and swirling snow. The dead were all around, relentless. Torches! Fire! Stannis roared, spurring men to douse the whites in flames. Some took heed, dropping steel in favor of blazing brands. But the fight was frenzied, lines shattering as men tried to avoid the whites' ghastly claws. Blood splattered the snow. Horses bolted. The dead pressed in, an unyielding wave of horror. Jon Snow cut down a white that lunged at him, Longclaw's Valyrian steel severing it in a single blow. For a moment, the creature twitched on the ground, then went still. Valyrian steel, dragonglass. Stannis recalled that these could kill White Walkers, but whites required only fire or dismemberment, though the latter was easier said than done. Another white rushed at Jon from behind. Tormund bellowed and cleaved it with an axe, tossing the remains aside. Stannis hacked at another that tried to drag one of his knights away. He felt the sickening crunch as bone gave under steel. Still, they just kept coming. Melisandre appeared on a slight rise behind them, her cloak swirling. She raised her hands to the sky, chanting in a resonant voice. The wind shifted, stirring the flames of the scattered torches. One white, near her, burst into sudden, intense fire, collapsing in a writhing heap. Another spontaneously ignited. The Red Woman's eyes blazed as she invoked the power of her god. Emboldened, men regrouped around the largest fires. They herded whites into the flames or hewed them apart. For every white destroyed, though, another seemed to lurch from the snow. Stannis realized they were being surrounded. They had to break out or be consumed. "Form ranks," he roared. "Move south, back to the wall." Jon, hearing the command, bellowed the same. Tormund took up the call. Slowly, the living forced their way through the writhing dead, stepping over corpses that still twitched. Pockets of the column collapsed as men were overwhelmed, but others managed to push forward. Stannis guided his horse in short charges, trying to keep the route open. Every moment was a swirling nightmare of rotting limbs, blue eyes, and the stench of death. Then, like a thunderclap, a different figure emerged from the mist. Tall, impossibly tall, with flesh like ice, eyes a glowing blue so vibrant it hurt to look upon. A White Walker. It strode silently, carrying a spear of ice, stepping through the carnage as if it owned the snows. The temperature seemed to drop further around it. Men stumbled back in terror or rushed to attack only to have their steel shatter on the creature's weapon. The walker advanced on the largest knot of soldiers, dismissing them with strokes of its spear that left them broken or dying. Jon Snow shouted, "Fall back. You can't face it with normal steel." He urged his horse forward, but the press of whites slowed him. The walker turned its cold gaze on Stannis, who sat astride his horse a dozen yards away. A chill ran down the king's spine. This was not an enemy of flesh and blood. This was an ancient horror. He brandished a sword, though he knew it was likely futile. The walker raised its spear, a soundless threat, and advanced. But then a swirl of flame erupted between them. Melisandre, her hands blazing with unnatural fire, stepped into the path. She shouted words in the tongue of Aes-High. For a moment, the walker paused as if surprised. Then it thrust its spear. The flame guttered, forced back by an invisible cold. Melisandre reeled, the white frost creeping across the ground at her feet. She redoubled her chant, and the flame soared upward, a bright orange conflagration. The walker hissed silently, recoiling a fraction. Stannis seized the moment, spurring his horse. But as he charged, he knew normal steel would be useless. He had a single chance. He aimed for the walker's spear. Their weapons met, and a shockwave of cold and heat erupted, knocking Stannis from his saddle. He crashed into the snow, the breath driven from him. Through blurred vision, he saw the walker raising its spear, ready to impale him. Fire crackled from somewhere behind. He fumbled for his sword, but it had flown from his grip. Suddenly, Jon Snow emerged, longclaw in hand. He leapt between the walker and Stannis, blocking the icy spear with Valyrian steel. A ringing crack sounded, and a shard of ice flew as the walker's spear splintered. The creature recoiled again, turning its icy gaze on Jon. Longclaw glinted in the fiery glow cast by Melisandre's sorcery. Jon swung with all his might. The walker raised an arm to block, but the Valyrian steel bit through the frozen limb. A soundless wail rippled through the air. The walker seemed to shatter, collapsing into a spray of icy fragments that dissolved into mist on the snow. With their commander gone, the whites faltered. Melisandre seized the chance, chanting louder. Torches and brandished flames flared bright. The men rallied, hacking and burning the whites until many collapsed. Others simply stopped moving, as though their animating force had fled with the walker's demise. Soon, the men found themselves standing among piles of broken corpses. The air reeked of burnt flesh and frozen rot. Stannis clambered unsteadily to his feet, spitting snow. Jon helped him stand, panting from exertion. "Your Grace," Jon gasped, "are you hurt?" Stannis coughed, checking his limbs. Nothing broken, he managed, though his ribs ached fiercely. He stared at the spot where the White Walker had fallen. Nothing remained but shards of ice melting in the blood-spattered snow. "You killed it," he said in a hollow voice. Jon nodded, chest rising and falling. "Valyrian steel. It works as we thought." Melisandre approached, her robes singed at the edges, face pale but fierce. "One victory," she said quietly. But there will be more. All around them, survivors huddled together, trembling in shock. At least a quarter of the men lay dead or dying. The rest bore wounds, many serious. The whites were destroyed or scattered, but the cost had been high. The day felt as if the sun refused to shine any brighter. Stannis surveyed the broken bodies, the bloody snow, the silent remnants of the White Walker. He felt neither triumph nor relief. Only a cold dread in the pit of his stomach. They had faced but a fraction of the enemy's power. In the distance, an icy wind moaned as though from the throat of something vast and inhuman. Jon said hoarsely, "We must return to the wall. Tend to our wounded. Burn our dead." Stannis agreed. His men, battered and shaken, began to collect the fallen. The living carried torches, fearful that any corpse might rise again. A hush clung to them, broken only by hushed sobs or pained moans. Stannis's face remained a mask of iron as he gathered what was left of his command. He would not show fear, but inside he felt the enormity of what they faced. No siege of a castle, no battle for a throne could compare to an enemy who needed no rest and did not break. Their forced march back to Castle Black was solemn. They bore the wounded on makeshift litters, leaving behind pyres for the dead. Stannis demanded all bodies be burned, not buried. The men built bonfires that crackled against the winter sky, sending black smoke into the air. Melisandre murmured prayers to Lawler, and Jon said words for those who kept the old gods or the Seven. In the swirl of ashen flakes, Stannis glimpsed the cost of this war. Brave men reduced to cinders. Horses half-eaten by the whites. The stench made some wretch. Yet it was necessary. When they reached Castle Black, the gates swung open to reveal anxious faces. Men rushed to help them inside, hauling the wounded to the maester's care. The yard was a flurry of activity, black cloaks mingling with Baratheon soldiers, wildlings peering from corners. Tormund, seeing the battered survivors, offered grim condolences. "Lost a good many, I see," he said softly, for once subdued. "Damn the dead." Stannis dismounted, wincing at pain in his side. He looked at Jon. "They will come again. And in greater numbers." Jon ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaustion carving lines in his face. "Yes. We must be ready." Melisandre's voice cut through the gloom. "If we cannot gather every force in the realm, we will fall. Winter is here." Stannis stared at the ramparts of the wall, hoarfrost glimmering on ancient ice. He recalled how once he had come here seeking an army from the wildlings. Now he was here with that army alongside the Night's Watch, the free folk, battered knights, northern levies. And still it might not be enough. But he would not yield. He was Stannis Baratheon, the man who refused to burn his own daughter, who would not break in the face of storms. If the White Walkers brought their endless cold, then he would meet them with iron and fire. The realm demanded it, and Shireen's life demanded it, and perhaps, in some distant corner of his soul, he believed it was the only righteous cause left. Men bustled around him, leading the horses away, preparing for the next battle. No one knew how soon that might come. Stannis stood in the yard until the last of the wounded were carried indoors. Snow drifted across his boots. He neither moved nor spoke, lost in thought. Finally, he turned, stepping toward the keep. Tomorrow, they would fortify the wall further, plan new defenses. If the others came, they would find him waiting. And if he died, at least he would die fighting for the living, not succumbing to the darkness that once nearly claimed his soul. In the gathering dusk, as the shadows lengthened, he set his jaw and walked on, unbowed.